5 million, was it? Or much more, if you'll come with me to Kamino to be cloned.
What's up, meta nerds? This video will be the complete Legends life story of Jango Fett. Unlike with the Cody documentary where we combine the canon and Legends lore, Jango's story has a lot that simply is mutually exclusive. The most obvious is his upbringing. For sure, Jango Fett in Legends is Mandalorian, and was one of the single most important Mandalores throughout the entire history. You would have to look back to the times of the ancient Mandoade to find anyone that could rival his legacy. I think it's pretty cool that there's such a big out-of-universe debate on who is and isn't truly Mandalorian, how that should be defined, and so forth. Because that was a huge debate within Mandalorian culture inside of the lore, as you will see with the conflicts that were raging when Jango was still just a young boy. So these videos will cover each and every bit of lore on Jango Fett, from birth through death, and even look at how his son Boba would carry on the Mandalorian legacy, and strengthen their culture. But let's go back to 66 BBY. On the Outer Rim world of Confronting, within the Mandalore sector, the newborn Jango was taken home by his mother and father to their farm. The Fett family farm was one of several large and highly productive farming operations on the agricultural world of Confronting, something of the breadbasket of Mandalorian space. The ancient crusading Mandalorians of the Old Republic era had conquered this world thousands of years ago, and the people that immigrated here became the ancestors of this now Mandoa world. Though not a luscious planet, these were a hardworking people that were able to turn the arid terrain into a surplus. And though in the Outer Rim, crime was never a problem here, the Mandalorian culture instilled a strong sense of self-reliance, training in both hand-to-hand combat and weaponry for each and every member of the population. The people of Confronting were known throughout the galaxy to be both incredibly tough and honorable. This planet was ruled by a governor who oversaw the Journeyman Protectors, a law enforcement group that upheld the Mandoa codes of honor. One anecdote comes from Horvath, who ate a human convict from Confronting. But before he devoured him, he was told that the laws there were so strict that even cheating in games is a capital offense. So this was the environment Jango and his sister Arla grew up in. We also need to keep in mind that in 738 BBY, the Jedi launched the attack on Mandalore that would result in lasting environmental destruction, pushing them into the biocubes and dome cities that now dot the lifeless deserts, on what had always been a vibrant green and blue world. And culturally, this war gave rise to a faction called the New Mandalorians. These were pacifists who would eventually produce those like Duchess Satine who reigned during the Clone Wars. But there were still militant-minded mercenary Mandos throughout the galaxy. On Confronting, the Journeyman Protector in charge of the district containing the Fett's farm was a man who went by the name Jaster Muriel. Remember, the law had things on the book that could see you executed for lying, so when Jaster learned of the deep corruption of a superior officer, he felt bound by duty to kill him. The other superiors did not agree, and had Jaster exiled from Confronting, upon which he would join the Mandalorians that were still acting as warriors, not the pacifists who were growing in strength on Mandalore, while Fett's father would fill the new opening in the Journeyman Protectors. This was all decades before Jango's birth, sometime around 90 to 70 BBY, and those warrior Mandos had splintered into two groups that were now waging a full civil war. And so now you had three factions. Of course, they each believed that they were the true Mandalorians, but Jaster Muriel understood branding enough to call his forces the true Mandalorians. And they were fighting against Death Watch, led by Tor Vizsla. The Death Watch Mandos wanted to up their violence, return to the lost age of Mandalorian crusaders who set the galaxy ablaze during the time of the Old Republic. Believing that might made right, anyone who could not defeat them was by definition their inferior, and deserving of subjugation. While the true Mandalorians followed what was called the Super Commando Codex, a new code of honor for these new times. Now the term Mandalore meant sole ruler in the Mandoa language, a term that dated back to Mandalore the Conqueror over 4,000 years ago. As leader of the true Mandalorians, Jaster Muriel took up the title Mandalore, and with this he wanted to reaffirm the warrior codes. But with his own twists, he and his followers felt that the old ways were too violent. There was no honor in being a bloodthirsty marauder blindly tearing through anything that came before them. Death Watch and Vizsla claimed that this was the very definition of Mandalorian, that of course claiming the name True Mandalorian was just a semantic trick to distract from the fact that this Jaster character was changing what it meant to be Mando. In 58 BBY, Jaster Muriel found his forces in the middle. The pacifists, New Mandos thought he was too violent, Death Watch thought he was too weak, and this civil war would come to Confronting. Jaster's forces were being routed, and he was now being hunted on his homeworld. Vizsla shouting out, quote, "You can't escape me, Jaster. I'll burn all your hiding places to the ground." and execute anyone who helps you. Days later, we see a young Jango Fett making his way through the fields, noticing odd footprints in the mud. His father would startle him and remind the boy that he needs to get to work fixing the harvester and stop playing detective. When Jango asks what the basket is for, his dad says it was for a beggar in the fields. The boy would go on to work repairing the machine under the hot sun, when a group of armed men descend on him. They ask if he's seen any strangers around these parts, and after a brave response, the leader threatens to kill the boy. We see that even at just 8 years old, young Jango is very observant. He admits that he had seen some tracks of someone wearing soldier boots, and that his dad was taking food to someone. With this information, the thugs force the boy to lead them to the Fett family farm. The Mandos fan out and cover the area, using the threat of a blaster to the boy's head. The father comes out to confront Vizsla and Death Watch. They subdue him and violently proceed with their interrogation. Battered and bloodied, Jango sees that his father does not back down, instead stating that he is a journeyman protector, that he is the law. Death Watch is unimpressed and grab Jango by the hair, saying, quote, "Answer me or your kid will be wearing your brains." Tears pour out of Jango's eyes, but just then a blaster bolt whizzed by and directly through the visor of the armored Mando. Everyone is stunned, Jango looking at his dead captor, Vizsla whipping around only to see Mama Fett with a smoking blaster rifle. His father knows this is the boy's only chance, shouts for him to run, and more tears fall as Jango sprints into the tall vegetation. As he gets deeper into the field, he is snatched up by another band of armored, blaster-wielding Mandos. But they open fire on the Death Watch thugs that had chased after Jango. And back at the Fett homestead, we see that Vizsla heard this firefight in the bush. He decided to burn down the fields to chase the true Mando forces out. And as for Jango's family, Vizsla coldly says that they should be quickly put to death so that they could just move on. His father, mother, and sister were just a side note, a bunch of inconsequential objects in Vizsla's way. He has them senselessly killed and tossed aside. In the fields, Jaster was mobilizing his forces, and turns to the sobbing boy to tell him simply that his family was dead. He would need to come with the Mandos to survive. And though devastated, young Jango sees that he has to spring to the rescue, as the true Mando forces are becoming lost. He pushes past Jaster and leads the way, knowing which trails to take through his family fields. The boy leads them into an irrigation tube, and Jango says that they could travel through the tunnels to exit on the other side of the farm. Though Jaster's second-in-command, Montross, worries that they might get boiled alive. They would emerge, and the true Mando forces said that they need to catch Vizsla as he resupplies. And again, the 8-year-old boy steps up, showing his incredible bravery and intelligence. He says he knows where they will be selling food and power cells in the nearest town. Jaster asks the boy if he can shoot, and when he gets a yes, he says that his father was a good man for teaching Jango how to use a blaster. In the dusty streets of town, Death Watch storms in on their armored personnel carrier, looking forward to 2 days of pillaging and conquering. One of the Mandos would act as a cripple, and once pushed, he whips around and blasts through the armor at close range. Jaster and Montross were in position to encircle them, raining down fire from all directions, providing Jango the opportunity to run underneath the vehicle and place an explosive. Once clear, he gives the command to detonate the APC. The explosions engulf the streets in flames and shrapnel, and as Jango runs, he sees the Mandos sharpshooting Death Watch left and right. And then he notices that Vizsla's second-in-command was cowering in shock. The boy raises the blaster to his head, exclaiming, "You killed my family." The only response he gets was matter of fact, saying they were just casualties of war, kid, before a hidden blade pops out and nearly severs the boy's head. Jaster was searching the battlefield but sees that Vizsla had escaped. Jango is now scrambling for his blaster, and in this very first battle, he is able to whip around and get a shot into the man's chest. His whole life had changed forever in just a few hours. He was now an orphan and had taken a man's life. But this was the story of many foundlings that were adopted into the ranks of Mandalorians. Jaster places a hand on the distraught youth, showing he was proud, but saying they needed to go, now. Taking the boy into his arms and picking him up, Jaster asks if he feels better now, to which Jango replies, "Not yet." Jaster knew that this was a Mandalorian answer. Over the next 6 years, Jaster would raise Jango as his adoptive son. His suit of armor would be mostly green with red accents, with the armor on his shoulders and knees being yellow, a look that would be adopted by his son decades later. He would now be 14 years old, and granted his first leadership role, and we see that all respected him among the ranks. In their mothership that served as their base of operations, his close friend Silas knew that Jango was excited about being given a squad. Jaster calls a meeting and says that since this was Jango's first time as squad commander, the mission would be a simple extraction. Court of Defense was paying these mercs to save one of their rookie squads that was pinned down on the inner rim world of Corda 6. The report said enemy forces were poorly armed and disorganized, and second in command Montross gives the units their objectives. Jaster would be in charge of the ground forces, clearing out the LZ, and as Jaster moves with his squad to the dropships, he turns to his adoptive son and says to make him proud. Montross is mobilizing his unit, but turns to the young man to make an odd statement, feeling the need to remind him that Jaster was not his real father, that this loyalty between them could cloud his judgment, and maybe hurt his ability to make the right decision for the clan, a mistake Montross hopes Jango will not make. With this strange send-off, the dropships race out of the capital ship hangar. Jango reminds his boys to check their ammo, and to keep an eye on each other. He wants to make sure his first command sees each of his brothers home. But within seconds, they get hit by a flurry of ion cannon fire. Their ship had lost all power and was forced to make a crash landing. Though this was a rough start, Jango tries to keep them focused. As the ramp descends, these first seconds of his battlefield command, several of his men are killed instantly, blaster bolts to the head dropping them at his feet, and the 14-year-old commander tells his units to find cover in the muddy trenches. Jango was furious with their allies' poor intel. The enemy forces were both well-armed and highly organized. The dropships were all being peppered with bolts from mounted weaponry. The Mandalorians were one of the toughest forces in the galaxy, pushing ahead with gauntlet flamethrowers engaged, and soaring overhead with their iconic jetpacks. Jango pushes forward and tries to calm Jaster, but his casualties keep increasing, forcing him back behind cover. Jaster calls all forces to regroup on Jango, but Montross and the Flyboys want to push the fight to the mounted guns. The Mandalore gives a direct order to retreat, but this is ignored. Montross's forces do kill several foes, but an enemy grenade kills many of his men. Even he would have died if Jaster had not come to the rescue. Still, the leader says that they are retreating. They cannot continue with a plan that was based off of bad intel. And as they make their way down the hill, Jaster calls his second-in-command's plan idiotic, but notes that Jango took initiative and used this distraction to sneak around the target. His unit made its way through the forest and was now in an open area, where the Allied security forces were supposedly in hiding waiting for evac. Just as they step into the clearing, Deathwatch erupts from under the brush and opens fire. Jango immediately recognizes them and has to catch his friend Silas up to speed about the bad blood between Vizsla and Jaster. Jango would personally kill many of them with blaster, explosive, and flamethrower before telling his Mandalore that their friends were behind this whole botched mission. Jaster asks if he sees Vizsla, and right on cue, his arch-rival emerges from an enormous vehicle. The Mandalore says that they would have been safely off-world by now if Montross hadn't rushed ahead, and declares that if they do survive, Montross would no longer be a part of the true Mandalorians. Vizsla fires a rocket that scatters them. As Montross soars above his leader, he says that he's done taking orders. He leaves Jaster to die, and within seconds, the laser cannons from the Deathwatch vehicle rip through the Mandalorian's armor, disintegrating his knee to immobilize him, followed by several bolts through his torso. And in the cockpit, Vizsla says to himself that he can finally wipe the name Jaster Mareel from Mandalorian history. Jango had emerged from the forest just in time to witness his adoptive father's death, but his friend pulls him back from rushing into the bolts. Vizsla was too much of a coward to fight his sworn enemy honorably, and upon seeing Jango's unit, he peels off in his vehicle and flees the scene. Jango makes his way over to their downed Mandalore, removing his helmet to look into the eyes of the man who saved his life all those years ago. Meanwhile, at the LZ, we see Montross rushing the forces to evac, claiming Jango had died trying to rescue Jaster. But as they are boarding the dropships, they see the adoptive son come over the hill, Mandalore lying dead in his arms. Montross says that if he wants to honor Jaster, he should realize that as second in command, he should now be the leader. But Jango says they cannot follow someone who let their Mandalore die alone on the battlefront. And blasters raise all around him, Montross realizing that Jango's act of bravery over the years had won the hearts of his fellow Mandos. He is outraged that his coup had failed, bested by a 14-year-old young man, but he has no choice but to flee. All the true Mandalorians recognize Jango Fett as Jaster's legacy, and to honor him, he would now sport the black and red markings of their fallen leader. Jango would reign as the new Mandalore for the next 18 years, all the while never giving up on his burning passion to get revenge on the man that had killed both his entire family and then his adoptive father. This rage honed him into a weapon, rivaling the greatest Mandalorians in their thousands of years of warrior history. Finally, he had tracked Vizsla to the outer rim world of Galadran, They were hired by the governor of this world to put down a local insurrection, and the rebels were all killed with a dazzling display of deadly limbs, blasters, and rockets. Victorious, Fett would make his way to the governor's castle, where we see the leader of this world was trembling with fear. Jango took this job because he knew that the governor was secretly funding the rebuilding of Death Watch. Blaster raised, he calls out this alliance, and demands to know the location of Vizsla. When the governor pathetically denies any knowledge, his eyes give away a clue, looking off to the corner of the room. Out of the curtains rush the cowardly sect of Mandos, blaster bolts flying through the air and tearing apart the plush quarters, as the Mandalore ducks behind a column and shouts, "You've crossed the wrong man, Governor," before using the jetpack to fly through a window. He sends some parting shots back at Death Watch, but before he can escape, Vizsla shows his own sharpshooting skills and lands a bolt into the jetpack. It smokes and sputters out, but Vizsla doubts that his enemy is dead. Just then, the Jedi emerge in their consular-class cruisers. As per the governor's plan with Death Watch, he begged the Jedi Order to help him, claiming that the Mandalorians were killing political activists, and Vizsla says to tell them that Jango was ordering the deaths of women and children too, before Vizsla promises to go and provide those bodies to show the Jedi as evidence. Back in the wilderness, we see the Mandalore dropping out of the sky, but making a relatively safe landing in a snowbank. But the fall had damaged his comlink, and Jango knows that the Jedi may be the only warriors in the galaxy that could give his forces a tough fight. He races through the snow trying to call out to his commander, but nothing is getting through. A Jedi named Dooku was leading the strike team, and they already had the location of the Mandalorian camp long before the ships even landed, encircling the warrior's position as Jango frantically tries to make his way down to his men. The Jedi activate their blades, and Dooku makes his introduction, reading off the accusations and informing these hardened professional killers that they were now under arrest. And when Dooku's Padawan Kamari Vosa says that if the Mandos want to fight, the Jedi will end it quickly, Fett orders his men to open fire, and to kill her first. He knows that he cannot allow these saber-wielding sorcerers close in on him, but is surprised by how efficient these Jedi were at sending bolts back to the Mandalorians. Quickly, the Mandalore has to change the plan, ordering a shift to explosives, and as rockets come flying at the circle of Jedi, they are forced down into the pit where Jango's forces would suffer their first losses. His second-in-command, Miles, soars above them to rain down fire from above, but a quick-reacting Jedi would leap up to intercept, severing the Mandalorian in half, the two pieces of his friend falling right in front of Jango. Enraged, he would seem to embody the ancient war god of the Mandawade. Out of weapons, he used his bare hands to rip a Jedi from behind and strike at their spine, pick up a rock and bash in their skulls, and use his athleticism to outmaneuver and headbutt a sixth Jedi. A critical wound that would cause a hemorrhage, blood spewing out of the Jedi's mouth, before he fell dead before a Fett. This killing of 6 Jedi with his bare hands was enough to solidify Jango's notorious reputation throughout the galaxy, but he would fall to his knees, knowing that he was surrounded. Dooku's team had killed all of the other Mandalorians. In Jango's eyes, these were the only true Mandalorians left in the galaxy. The name Fett would now be infamous throughout the Jedi Order, and Dooku stared at the carnage that also cost him half of his Jedi. A mission that he thought was just the latest of the Council's poor decisions, dragging the Jedi into a corrupted position as political warriors. Dooku would turn Fett over to the governor of Galadran, who then sold him into slavery while also backing the rise of Death Watch. From the rank of Mandalore, the sole ruler of the Mandalorians, he was now just another anonymous slave working in a spice ship. It would be 2 years in this soul-crushing environment, until one fateful day when pirates became his unknowing rescuers. His chains were broken in the firefight, and the moment he saw an opening, he grabs a blaster and blows away his overlord, before using the chaos to commandeer a ship to make his escape, heading right back to Galadran. The governor got word of Jango's escape, but did not have time to prevent the fallen Mandalore from getting what he came for. All these years, the governor had Jango's armor on display, but he didn't leave it in the original paint, however, stripping the black and red coats to show the polished metal and adding new blue accents. As he says to his droid assistant while rushing to his personal museum, quote, "I didn't spend thousands restoring that suit to have it stolen by that thug." The true owner, the last of the true Mandalorians, was already ready for combat, and in the gleaming armor tells the governor to give up the location of Vizsla. The governor knows that this madman was not playing around, and tells him that Death Watch was headed to Corellia. Moments later, in Vizsla's flagship, his engineer tells him that he's detecting a starfighter, and in just seconds the vessel crashes into the engine array. This single, precise strike had disabled their sublight engines, and their life support systems were quickly fading. In the command bridge window, they spot what looks like a missile, only to have Vizsla realize, to his horrified surprise, that it was Fett. Wrist rockets blow through the transparasteel window. As usual, the cowardly Mando pretender was fleeing down the corridors, hoping the blast doors would cut Jango off, but that trusty jetpack shot him into a roll that resulted in a swift punch to the jaw. Fett knocks him down and pulls his dual Westar 34 blasters on him, but Vizsla shows that he was leader of his forces for good reason. He could fight when he wanted to, stripping the blasters away, saying, quote, "I guess Jaster didn't finish your education before I killed him, so let me show you how to open a man's throat with your fingers." But the attack on the vessel was leading to chain reactions of explosions throughout the ship. A blast separates them and stuns Jango, which his archenemy takes advantage of, delivering an elbow to the throat and leaving the once Mandalore to go down with the ship. He orders everyone to evacuate on escape pods, and just as he opens the door to his pod, he senses the Blue Devil launching himself at him, uttering only a pathetic "no," before Jango grabbed hold of him and proceeded to beat him senseless the entire way down to the surface of Corellia. But Vizsla would use the crash landing to break free from Fett and then run and hide in the bush. And as Jango emerged, he opens up with a blast from his flamethrower. Fett boosts over the spray and drop kicks his enemy to the ground. Local predators, the dire cats, were taking notice of these two food sources and watched as Fett delivered blow after blow, knocking Vizsla into a river. But in a split second, he would get a whipcord shot off to wrap up Fett's legs, pulling him down into the water with him. With his legs bound, we see that Jango loses his advantage. His blade would come out and pierce Jango's skin. Another cowardly move. The foe Mando used poison against Fett, something that was making it nearly impossible just to stay conscious. Vizsla would then grab a large stick and proceed to bombard Jango's helmet, eventually knocking it clean off. Instead of finishing the kill, he gloats, telling the adoptive son that Jaster would be disappointed. And thinking back to that day in the hangar, when Jaster looked at him on his first mission and said, "Make me proud," Jango calls on something within him, gets a second wind, and activates his own gauntlet blade. And with this rage, he spins around and cuts open Vizsla's belly. His arch enemy for 20 years now, the man who killed both his family and adoptive father, was now trying to keep from bleeding out. He tries to act tough, but Jango tells him that he won't kill him, but they will, as the dire wolves launch from cover to devour Vizsla alive, denying Vizsla a respectable death at the hands of another Mandalorian. Though vengeance was sweet, he felt the darkness of death consuming him as well. The poison would leave him unconscious for about 12 hours. Jango thought surely he was going to die, but he comes to with a group of horrified children staring into his eyes. His vision comes back, and with a pounding head, he stumbles to his feet, noting that the beast must not have devoured him because the poison made him smell like he was already dead and rotting. When the kids ask where he was going, he replies simply, "To find a job." His journey so far was a small-scale version of what happened to the Mandalorians thousands of years ago. Once their Mandalore was broken and defeated by Revan, they all split up into smaller clans, becoming bands of mercenaries taking odd jobs, falling a long way from their massive and terrifying armies of conquerors. So though this Mandalore was still alive, he had no people to lead. Whatever was left of Death Watch were his enemies, and he felt no connection to the pacifist new Mandalorians. He too would become a bounty hunter, and just as he rose to become the greatest of the Mandalorians, he would start his climb to the title of the best bounty hunter in the galaxy, with the help of this updated gear. Now, a lot of this was already in the suit, but thanks to the governor wanting to show off, it was all in new condition. Starting with the boots, they had magnetomic adhesion, allowing him to stay in place when in zero-G, something that helped a lot of droid units, and which would later be incorporated into the clone troopers. The knee pads each had rocket dart launchers, a nasty little trick when locked in melee combat, and on the thighs rested a pair of Westar 34 blasters. This little silver beauty was a modern marvel. It packed more power than most blaster rifles out there, a damage output that was only rivaled by the later DL-44, a weapon that was banned by the Empire, and was one of the many things that made Han Solo so deadly. To help with his quick draw, he further modified the gun to be lighter by removing much of the handle. This little button would indicate when the power pack was running low, but the Westar 34 packed a punch and could fire hundreds of bolts before needing to be replenished, which was made incredibly easy with these combined Tabana gas and power cell cartridges in one unit. These cartridges were so small that the pouches Jango wore on his belt could contain more than enough ammo for any mission. This sash underneath is actually to honor the position held by his father and adoptive father before that, as it is the traditional sash binding of the Journeyman Protectors, a nice integration of his two backgrounds. Moving up, we see this vest under the armor plating. This was an extra layer of defense to protect his vital organs. an energized blast dissipation vest that would scatter the energy of blaster bolts, working much like a bulletproof vest in the sense that it might not be harmless, but at least life-saving. And this is actually something that the much boohooed Stormtrooper armor did as well. Each of the gauntlets were essentially interchangeable weapon mounts, and Jango's standard loadout was a projectile dart shooter, whipcord thrower, retractable blade, and variable munitions launcher. Now looking at the helmet, these two small triangular objects are a part of what was called the pineal gland sensor system, which worked with the HUD in the helmet to essentially allow Fett to see behind him. And under the helmet were these coverings over the ears that connected him to various comm systems, some of which would be connected back to the Slave One, which were also made to protect him from sonic weaponry. While the targeting rangefinder is a Mando classic, giving all sorts of environmental data and helping with target acquisition. The jetpack was an iconic Mandalorian symbol, and we see that he used both the Z6 and JT-12 model. They have a lot in common, but the main difference was the type of missile loaded into the top, these things over here, and the thrust exhaust and gimbaling thrust nozzle positions. The neat feature is that this missile can be swapped out for a variety of different types of explosives, and even a grappling hook. Though this equipment all helped to accent his deadly set of skills, this first year would have a major setback. In 41 BBY, Jango would somehow lose his armor. The exact details of this are unclear, but we learn of this through a woman named Sheikah Tull, someone who had been Jango's lover for these past months, and who helped him recover the suit, only to be separated from Fett when pirates attacked their vessel. Next time we see him would be 9 years later, in 32 BBY, the same year as the Battle of Naboo. A terrorist group known as the Bando Gora were crippling industries crucial to the Republic. Darth Sidious knew that they were led by a fallen Jedi, and understood that any variables in the galaxy that he was not in charge of could prove to be a threat to his plans to bring about the revenge of the Sith. He would contact his own fallen Jedi, the Count who had become Darth Tyrannus, to task him with the mission of eliminating the Bando Gora. After the briefing, Dooku asked if his lord has any updates on the clone army.
Our cloners require a host. You must find an ideal specimen, perhaps among the galaxy's most dangerous mercenaries.
I shall accomplish both of these tasks with a single stroke, Master.
He would post a lucrative hit on the leader of the Gora, attracting the most elite hunters in the galaxy. At this time, Jango was in the middle of a Republic contract, closing in on the lifelong criminal Miko Ginty. He finds his target commanding a Borik in a pit fight in Outland Station, a popular waypoint in Hutt space. Using the viewfinder to zero in on his target, he eliminates both of the bodyguards with those powerful Westar 34s. Scaring his target off the platform and down into the pit, Jango would calmly descend with his jetpack and twirl his blasters back up to Miko.
Dead or alive, Miko.
But the crafty criminal used his neural remote to make the enormous bug take a swing at the Mandalorian, an attack that sends the pack flying off into the crowd. But the armor absorbed the blow, and Fett transfers the momentum into a roll back onto his feet. The carapace was so tough that it would take dozens of blasts to finally bring the creature down. Then Jango would have to give chase through the space station, blasting away Miko's allies, only to have him escape via a stolen speeder. As the Force would have it, this merchant was also selling a jetpack that he had just picked up from the arena, and Jango kindly asks for it back.
I'll take that off your hands.
How much you offering?
Your life.
After another chase through the shipping zone, Fett sees that Miko has made it back onto his ship, a Trimark 7 called the Longshot. At this point, Jango is already considered the most notorious bounty hunter in the galaxy by most, and Miko surely heard the legends of the Mandalorian that killed 6 Jedi with his bare hands. But a part of him wonders if this was just a myth. He decides that with the ship's laser cannons and rocket launchers, there was no way Jango could survive. But with a decade of use with this armor and tech, Fett was nearly unstoppable, using the jetpack to evade, while sending bolt after bolt into key ship systems. The long shot saw complete failure, a fiery wreck smashing down. Jango walked up to his target.
I hate to admit it, but you're worth more alive.
I'll get you for this, Fett.
Meanwhile, we see that another man wearing Mandalorian armor was completing a bounty of his own.
Montross, I can pay you double.
The man who had betrayed Jaster Muriel had found himself in a similar position to the punk kid he once despised. And again, he must have been driven mad at how this younger man was again demanding more fear and respect. Back at Jango's hangout on the Outland Station, he collects his bounty from his Toydarian associate, Rosada.
You're short, Ross. Not trying to swindle me, are you?
Hey, you're forgetting my finder's fee.
And she says that she already has another bounty for him, tossing a hollow projector onto the table.
Greetings, Jango Fett. I am Tyrannus. You are one of a select few chosen to participate in a special hunt for a special prey.
The Toydarian is stunned.
5 million Republic credits.
5 million? Wow, that could make you for life.
But she is afraid for Jango, saying this Bando Gora group was too dangerous even for him, that no one sent after them has ever come back alive.
Worried about losing your finder's fees?
Now that's not fair. You know I worry about you.
Jango is not afraid and asks more about how this group works. Roz says she thinks they're behind the new Death Stick craze, and remembers that there was a small bounty on a Death Stick dealer on Coruscant. And as he leaves, we see that the Toydarian knew of the bad blood between Fett and the other Mando-seeming hunter.
I wouldn't be surprised if you ran into Montrose on this hunt.
I'd be surprised if I didn't.
This bounty centered around another relic of his past. It's unlikely that Fett would have known this, but Kamari Vosa was the one that he called Loudmouth in order to be killed first back on Galadran, the apprentice of Count Dooku, who fell to the dark side before her master. Over Coruscant, Jango emerges from hyperspace in his amphibious interstellar assault transport, or AIAT, a model of ship that was the precursor to the LAAT. It was called Jaster's Legacy, and at this point it was on its last legs, sputtering through space, something that Roz thought was ridiculous for such a well-paid merc. And she dropped some insights that you would normally have to pay a psych droid for.
You ever think maybe you hang on to that ship, those memories, because you're looking for someone to take under your own wing?
But with his briefing, he takes the old ship into a traffic lane and descends to a landing pad in the upper levels, making his way into a club that the target was known to frequent. When the bartender is resistant, Jango consults with his negotiators.
Listen, friend, I'm giving you a chance to save your club.
The club would erupt in blaster fire, but eventually he would find the dealer, wrapping him up with his trusty whipcord. The troubled youth knows he's in way over his head, and trades his life for the location of the warehouse that supplied the psychedelic substance. Fett would sneak his way into the facility, but the way this whole operation is run, the connection to the terrorist group, this enormous bounty, it all had Jango suspicious.
I've got a feeling these aren't ordinary death sticks. I'm transmitting a sample to you.
Taking a sample, he sends the data back to Roz for analysis. While Jango is blasting through the guards and working his way deeper into the warehouse, she confirms that these were no normal death sticks. They are laced with high levels of some unknown and untraceable neurotoxin. The trail would leave him into a carbon freezing facility, where he stumbles upon his past.
Montrose.
It's been a long time, Jango. Again, it looks like we're after the same thing.
He had captured the local drug lord and froze him already, but used the process to kill him. A lengthy blaster duel would force Montrose to flee, and Jango believes that an operation this large couldn't have been pulled off without the help of some corrupt politicians. And with some searching through Groff's computer, he's able to find his next target. Jango's deadly barroom brawl had scared a senator from Ryloth.
I want out! You hear me? Out!
Well, what do you know? Senator Trell.
The hunter would make his way up to the plush apartment tower, and dangles the politician over the ledge. Though a bounty hunter, he is still driven by a strong Mandalorian sense of honor. Remember, his father was the journeyman protector that filled the shoes of Jaster Mareel after he had been exiled for killing a corrupt official. Now it was Jango's turn. After Senator Trell told him that the supplier was a dug on the planet Malastare, Republic security forces show up in a gunship, and Fett chooses to let gravity decide this corrupt senator's fate, dropping him over the edge, and then blasting away the gunship before making his escape. Back on his ship, he consults with Roz to learn more about this target. In order to get an audience with him, Roz suggests capturing someone Sebulto put a hit on. The problem is that this guy was incarcerated on Uvo 4.
But Jango, we are talking about a maximum security prison.
It's just another job, Ross. I'll slip in and out before they notice he's missing.
While he punches in the hyperspace coordinates, Jango asks about Montrose, and Roz pleads with him to leave this dangerous bounty hunter life, one that can only end with his death.
Jango, dear, you work too hard. You got money. Why don't you meet a nice girl, settle down, have a kid? You won't live forever, you know.
Emerging in the asteroid field of Uvo 4, we see Jango had mastered the trick of writing a ship's signature in space, following close behind a cargo ship that was making its approach to the prison complex.
Captain, my scopes just picked up a ghost image in our sensor wig. Probably another glitch.
By quickly darting off at the exact right moment, he was able to covertly set down on the asteroid. He knows this one will be tougher than normal, and makes sure to attach a fresh rocket to his jetpack. As he sneaks deeper and deeper into the facility, he comes across a worker named Smoody, who tells him some of the terrifying history of Kamari Vosa, and her rise to become leader of the Bando Gora.
On some barrier moon beyond the outer rim, say he seen this same Jedi girl lop the heads of them 2 prisoners in some bizarre ritual.
He takes Fett to the level containing Bendix Fust, but is shocked to see another bounty hunter beat him to the target. Her method sent the whole facility on high alert, but Jango can tell that they will have to work together.
Careful, Jango. Trust no one. Isn't that your motto?
In order to get out, they would have to shut down the shield generator, and so he contacts that worker Smooty, who tells him how to do it. But notice how the professional killer is worried about this plan that may hurt his newly created ally.
What about you?
Oh, don't worry about me, stranger. You'll be a fine day to cash it all in. See you on the other side, eh, stranger?
After setting the main reactor to blow, he makes his way to the nearby hangar to commandeer one of the patrol ships to get himself, this female hunter, and their target safely away from the prison. The ship was a Firespray 31 model, a craft made by Kuat Drive Yards for patrolling the dangerous asteroid field prison complex. After liftoff, he spins around and sends 2 torpedoes as a parting shot, setting off a chain reaction that not only took out the other ships that might have given pursuit, but much of the asteroid itself. Montross gets an alert of this escape and notices Sebulto had a bounty on someone there, reasoning that this must be Jango working a lead on the Bando Gora case. Back in the Firespray 31, the Huntress introduces herself.
I'm Mademoiselle.
You must be new to the business.
Why, because you haven't heard of me?
No, because you're reckless.
And as they debate the merits of her plan, he points out that her recklessness cost him Jaster's legacy.
This babe is a big improvement over that relic.
She's a Firespray Pursuit Special, one of 6 prototypes manufactured for the prison. She's the last of her kind now.
Fett goes on to explain how now in the Republic records, this would be a dead craft.
I've deactivated her transponder. They'll assume she was destroyed with the rest. We're in the clear.
He makes his first jump to lightspeed in the craft that would come to symbolize Fett. As the pair pull up to Malastare, he explains why she will be the one to make the delivery, and how he will sneak his way back towards Sebulto's compound. After eliminating some Dug guards, he meets back up with Zam.
For a second there, I thought you were gonna blast me.
Don't worry, you're still more useful to me alive.
Thanks a lot.
Jango would rush into the compound in search of the Death Stick factory, and eventually discovers the criminal's throne room. After a firefight, the Dug flees down a secret passage, a chute that leads right into the drug processing center. Sebulto doesn't stick his landing. His target was dead, but he would still have to blast his way out of this enormous underground facility, eventually coming upon a ship that was used to transport the illicit goods. He thinks he can search through its logs to see where it has been, but this type of craft brings up bad memories from the time that he was a slave.
Looks like a slaver ship.
Yeah, I know.
As he starts hacking into the terminal, Montross reappears. And as they fight, they talk about the moments that changed both of their lives. How Montross caused the death of their leader, and Jango's subsequent leadership saw the death of all of the true Mandalorians.
After I left, you're the one who led the Mandalorians to their deaths.
We were betrayed.
To the Jedi. So I heard.
In the firefight, Jango would disable his ship, but the Mandalorian pretender was still able to run away. Zam would swoop in on the Firespray, and when she puts it together that Kamari Vosa was the head of the Bando Gora, that Fett and Montross must have some secret invite to take down this crazed cult leader, she wants to know more.
Wait a minute, I've heard that name. She's that Bando Gora head case. What's the prize, Fett? Tell me.
More than you'd make in a lifetime.
As he catches her up on the neurotoxins and the drugs, Wazelle thinks she knows why.
Instant brainwashing.
Jango had discovered that Vosa was on some unknown moon outside the galaxy, that there were shipments that were sent to the outer rim wasteland of Tatooine, working with the Hutts to use their vast shipping networks to move the Death Sticks. And Mama Raz was happy to see Jango with a lady friend.
You didn't tell me your new partner was such a looker.
She's got nothing on you, Ross.
This was one race season after her friend and fellow Tordarian Watto had lost everything he had betting against Anakin.
Poor sap lost everything in a pod race last season.
His only hope was to get some credits from a finder's fee, broadcasting out bounties that were taken out by Jabba the Hutt personally. Fett would find himself in the middle of a power struggle between Gardulla and Jabba, which would determine who would become the crime boss of Tatooine. While Jango was tracking down his target, Sam would go to Gardulla to see if there was any evidence that she was the Hutt connected to the Gora. And Raz has one final question before they depart.
Did you name that new ship of yours yet?
She's called Slave One.
Perhaps a reference to the rush of difficult memories which Jango had just been flooded by on the previous mission, seeing that slave ship. Fett's battle would take him across multiple neighborhoods in Mos Espa, whole blocks and landing pads that were swarming with thugs. Eventually he would make it to his target, and the scum thinks he had Jango outnumbered.
Hear that, boys? He's scared.
Difficult to decide whether any of you live.
When the smoke cleared, the target was dead, and Jango wasted no time throwing him down at Jabba's tail. The Hutt gives the credits due, but Jango pushes for information on the Bando Gora. Jabba is insulted to be accused of working with their kind, and tells him that Gardulla would have all the answers he needs. This unlikely alliance might prove to be life-changing for the two of them. If they could pull this off, Jabba would be the most powerful Hutt, and Jango the most powerful bounty hunter. He returns to his ship to tell Zam of the secret tunnel entrance Jabba revealed to him, but on the comm he hears his ally being captured. Before all signal is lost, he would have to rush through the passage, killing all sorts of local wild animals, like the Mastiffs and Tusken Raiders. Once he makes it into Gardulla's palace, he finds Zam in her cell. She says that she was able to spot the vault, and a chain around the slug's neck has the key. Jango says to wait here while he completes the mission. Zam was a newer bounty hunter, but she wasn't that stupid.
Guards!
The Gamorrean guards were able to haul Fett before their slimy overlord, and she takes great joy in seeing this hunter betrayed, breaking the news that Zam was a shapeshifter, a member of the Clawdite species. Despite what credit she could get for him, the slug decides to feed Fett to her crate dragon. In the pit, the towering beast stood ready to consume the Mandalorian, but Jango still had his most reliable weapons, his fists and his wits, knocking out the green pigs and taking an escape through a small shaft. Jango would have to reclaim all of his gear by relying on his martial arts, killing countless guards on his climb up to Gardulla's suite. When Fett steals the key off of the Hutt's neck, she is confused until he asks for the location of Kamari Vosa, a question that makes her laugh in astonishment.
Vosa!
She says he has no idea what he's facing, and refuses to give up any info. With the crate dragon screaming in the pit below, Fett comes up with an efficient way to dispose of this Hutt. A few pushes, and the thousands of pounds of slug are sent tumbling down to become food for her own pet. But sadly for the dragon, this room contained the vault. It was simply too dangerous to leave it, or any of the guards that showed up, alive. After they were all dispatched with a flurry of blaster bolts and a jetpack missile, with the area clear, he makes his way into the vault. But the data is encrypted. He has to send it to Roz for processing, and she laments the news that the girl she was hoping would become Mrs. Fett was a changeling all along.
I should have known better.
Oh, Jango, I was hoping you could get together.
Before he leaves Tatooine, he goes back to Zam's cell to call her out for this deception. Despite her pleas, Jango just walks away. As the Slave One prepares to go into hyperspace, he gets horrible news about the only person Jango actually cared for.
Rose, do you copy?
Sorry, Jango. Took a while to get her to hand over that data.
You just signed your death warrant.
The usually stoic, cool-headed warrior was now burning with rage, smashing the hollow screen on his new ship, and frantically making the jump to Outland Station. Jango races in to see her lying on the floor dying, surrounded by the destruction Montross wrought. He wants to rescue her, but there were thermal detonators set to explode, set to take Fett down with her. She was resigned to her fate. In her own way, she chose to be involved in the violent bounty hunter life too, and she doesn't want Jango to mourn her death, but to try and find some meaning in life.
Get Vosa. Collect your reward. Just find something to live for besides the money.
And the Slave One would pull off just seconds before the whole space station was reduced to debris. The Slave One was now headed to the coordinates Ross was able to decipher, a compound on the 4th moon of Bogdan. As soon as he arrives, he is swarmed by hundreds of slaves, who had become violent, mind-controlled demons under the influence of the neurotoxin-infused death sticks. Jango would fight his way into their twisted city, a death cult that revolved around a strange mixture of dark side energy and spirit divination, as this place was known by locals as the Moon of the Dead, being a moon that had been used as a mass grave dump site for millennia, a place various warlords used over eons to dispose of the evidence of their war crimes. All of this perverse and evil energy was tapped into by the cult's queen, the fallen Jedi Kamari Vosa. Jango would make his way through some of the enormous pits of rotting flesh, before moving into the underground catacombs. Emerging into yet another graveyard, he sees the ship of his arch-rival, and his blood begins to boil. At an enormous gate, he sees Montross waiting. They trade words before their final showdown, and what Montross is so impressed with concerning the Bando Gora is ironic, given Jango's eventual fate with the clone army.
Imagine, Jango, The power to send thousands of mindless assassins willingly to their deaths, to plunge the galaxy into anarchy.
The fallen Mando taunts Fett, saying they are one and the same. When the Westar 34s come out, Montross is surprised he doesn't want to fight like a true Mandalorian.
Not the Mandalorian way.
You gave up our ways, remember?
After a rocket and some well-placed bolts, the man who betrayed Jaster Mareel 20 years ago, who killed Ross, the only person Jango had been attached to in decades now, that traitor to all the Mando Ade, would be left to die, pleading that he deserved an honorable death at the hands of a Mandalorian, but Jango callously walks away, leaving Montross to be ripped to shreds by the mindless Bando Gora slaves, screaming his way into his grave like a wounded animal. No honor.
Jango! Come back!
From here it would be a trek through the dark caves and mist-shrouded canyons. Hundreds of Gora would be slain, but as he entered the evil citadel, the mindless grunts were able to overpower the greatest hunter in the galaxy, knocking him unconscious and locking him into a torture rack. The evil queen would make her introduction.
The blast helmet of a Mandalore warrior. Something I've not seen since I was a Jedi. I must have cut down 20 of your kind myself.
He tries to figure out who hired Fett, and gets in some of the details on how she was captured as a Padawan and warped by this cult, only to rise and become their leader. As she moves away, she censors another unwanted guest. Zam knew this was a high-paying job, and used a tracker she had left in the Slave One to follow him to the Death Moon. The rookie fails to take the quick shot, giving Vosa the chance to activate her 2 curved-hilt red lightsabers. Zam blasts away, but bolts are deflected, one eventually striking the hunter. Though she felt Jango had betrayed her, she knows again they would have to work together, using the next 2 shots to free the Mandalorian from his restraints. Jango springs to his feet and gets his Westars back, snapping away at the fallen Jedi. But each bolt is effortlessly sent away as Vosa flips to her retreat. Jango rushes to comfort Zam, and when she shows that she is too weak, Jango Fett gears up, ready to honor Raz's dying wish and secure the most lucrative bounty hunting contract in history. Pushing through another maze of catacombs, he catches up with the Bando Gora queen. In this small room, Jango would have to use his jetpack to secure the high ground, the only way to dodge those blades and rain down fire from a position that would be more awkward to deflect. This would work to force her to retreat into the throne room, where the firepower eventually overwhelmed the Jedi, her death throes seeing a burst of dark side energy as she collapsed to the floor.
Which will it be, bounty hunter? Dead or alive?
Congratulations, bounty hunter.
Tyrannus.
Dooku is thoroughly impressed with his performance. As Jango sees that this was all a complicated Jedi drama, he wonders why Dooku wouldn't just kill her himself.
To find you. This contest brought you to me. Of course, 5 million, was it? Or much more, if you'll come with me to Kamino. A chance at immortality, to pass on your ways to an army crafted in your image.
I want the first clone for myself, unmodified.
Before he departs, he is too honorable to leave behind the hunter that saved his life, but also not too generous with the credits.
We're going to split the bounty 50-50, right?
Don't push your luck, Sam.
We would learn that all this time Jango was completing this mission, Dooku was doing his research on this Mandalorian prospect. He had captured one of Jango's old friend, back from the true Mandalorian days, a fellow grunt named Silas. With applying via the use of force, electroshock, and chemical agents, he finally got Silas to reveal Jango's backstory, recounting the rise of Fett. Once he got what he needed, coldly tells the droid to stop his heart, killing this old friend of Jango just moments before speaking with the hunter. After the death of Vosa, Dooku would return to his castle to be greeted by his master, Lord Sidious hailing him via holo. The Dark Lord wants to be sure that Jango Fett was the right choice, and his apprentice recounts the events of Galadran. Tyrannus still shook by the fact that he killed 6 Jedi with his bare hands. And now, moments later, the Slave One would set down on the main landing pad at Dooku's estate. In the meeting room, we can see the blasters and saber are placed on the table while they further discuss these terms. Jango gets right to the point, saying he doesn't trust Jedi, and we see he didn't recognize Dooku as the one that led the attack 10 years earlier. When the Count says that he was there at Galadran, the Mando calls his blasters back into his hands in an instant, a move that shocks Dooku, as he doesn't see how Jango could have called on the Force. But where the Jedi relied on their sorcery, the Mandalorian relied on their tech. This was achieved through electromagnets in the gloves and blaster, and this act only reassures Tyrannus that this man should be the clone template. Now with his crimson saber in hand, these talks get heated, and Jango knows that he wouldn't fare well in a straight fight, and reveals that his suit had been pumping the air full of the deadly Kratos virus since he walked into Dooku's residence, a virus that Jango was inoculated against as a young boy on Concord Dawn. To get ahead of any calculations that the Count might be running in his mind, Jango goes on to explain that the antidote is in a self-destruct module on his ship, which will activate if the signal from his heart sensor stops reporting in. Smiling inside, this secretly made Dooku even happier. The perfect clone template indeed. But he wishes the bounty hunter will finish telling the rest of his story, going over the events that led to Galadran. When he was done, the fallen Jedi admits that he used this time to call on the living force to remove the virus from his body. And now Fett was impressed. He reiterates his demand that the first clone shall be unaltered, no tampering whatsoever, going on to tell Dooku that this was not sentiment, but that the child will become Jaster's legacy. Dooku agrees, and Fett tells him to lead the way to Kamino. Over the next decade, Jango would, in effect, become the new Mandalore, raising their warrior culture out of the ashes. The growth acceleration meant that in just a few years, he would have children to start training, while also caring for his infant son named Boba. As for the clones, the Kaminoans made sure to take care of all the behavior modification, while Jango personally trained them as Mandalorian warriors. Truly, this is important to consider, as Jango hated the Jedi, and the Sith were the ones that funded this army, while the Mandalorians had a long hatred for the Republic. But the clone troopers are raised in a more intense Mandalorian culture than most of the other Mandos in the galaxy who were just born into it. Remember, at this time, the pacifist new Mandalorians were in power, so Jango and the clones were some of the only ones still keeping up the old warrior ways. One of the earliest things they would learn was the Vodayan, meaning brothers all in the Mandoa language. It was an ancient war chant used for millennia. In the song, the warriors refer to themselves as the Wrath of Coruscant, something that has a triple meaning, as originally it referred to the fact that the original Mandalorians were all of the Tong species, native to Coruscant before being run off by their fellow sentient Coruscanti, the humans. The clones would now be fighting for Coruscant, the home of the Republic, but the third meaning is also that this force would bring about the end of the Republic. The first batch of troopers were the Alpha-class Arcs. To assist in the training and tactics, Jango would recruit powerful individuals that he felt still embodied the Mandalorian ethic. Warriors scattered across the galaxy, with no clan ties to the now dead factions of Death Watch and the true Mandalorians. 100 men and women that Jango would unify into a unit he called the Quevaldar. The introduction speech was harsh, but the credits were good, and the chance to pass the Mandalorian ethics onto millions was an opportunity they could not pass on. Jango's opening words were, quote, "You're the best in your field, the best soldiers, tacticians, sappers, communicators, survival experts. I picked you personally because I want you to train the best commandos in the galaxy. You'll have everything you need, whatever you want, except one thing, home. This is a top secret project. You'll not tell anyone where you're going, and you'll not leave Kamino, ever. As far as your friends and family are concerned, you're already dead." The name Quevaldar in the Mandoa language meant those who no longer exist, though it should be noted that only 75 of them identified as Mandalorians before this operation. The other ones were just elite warriors, who were said to be drawn into the culture while immersed on Kamino. 2 years into this program, Jango noticed Training Sergeant Cal Scarata as a standout leader. He had Scarata assist him in evaluating a group of clones that Chief Scientist said were defective. These 6 boys were too independent and declared uncontrollable. The cloners had a simple solution, that these mistakes would be eliminated and disposed of shortly, but Scarata stepped in and said he would adopt them. And Fett added that this kind of temperament might be good as infiltration and intelligence units. That night, Jango would go to Cal's quarters to see how he was holding up with his new kids. When the Mandalore walked in, he had the infant Boba in his arms, and Cal noticed that he looked just like the clones, while Jango explains that his son was worth more than all the credits he had been paid. It seems that Jango took Roz's dying wish to heart, knowing that she was right about his love of legacy, how he clinged onto Jaster's old ship for so long, that he truly wanted to pass on the sense of honor and purpose that he found as a distraught youth being brought into the Mando fold. But being a leader of 100 warriors isn't easy. Different shades of what it meant to be Mando always existed with any large group of these people. And one sergeant named Dread Priest thought he knew a more fun and expedient way to toughen the boys up, hosting battle circles in the lower levels of Typoca City, where he would pit the young clones against each other. Not fights to the death, but to dangerous levels of exhaustion and damage, sending several of them to the hospital. This was only discovered because the wounded were piling up in the hospital at such an explosive rate, and Quaveldar Dr. Mij Gillamar contacted Fett with his concerns. Of course, the Mandalore was able to solve this mystery, and after he beat Dredd nearly to death, he made sure to tighten up his controls on these trainers. One of the clones that was savagely beaten was an Alpha Arc named Spar. Genetic anomalies made him immune to the conditioning by the Kaminoans, but he was intelligent enough to fake uniformity so that he wouldn't be eliminated. Only that same doctor was able to spot his uniqueness, and called in a favor Jango owed him to help Spar escape. Though the Mando Code of Honor meant everything to Fett, he understood that Spar did not choose this life, and helped to smuggle him off Kamino by storing him in the Slave One. Ironically, this man would later come to take up the mantle as Mandalore, but that is a story for another day. Now 5 years before the Clone Wars, in 27 BBY, Jango was still taking contracts. As per their deal, Jango was not exclusive to the cloners. Certainly a majority of his life revolved around the Grand Army, but he could not give up his hard-earned notoriety as the infamous bounty hunter. While his dad was away, we see how young Boba looked up to his heroic father. The start of this job was routine, some quick and silent elimination of the perimeter guards, and slowly working his way into the building, using his whipcord and deadly hands to take out the threats in the room of his target, before emerging from the shadows to put a blaster to his target's head. He learns that it was Dredd in the Hutt that called this hit on the Black Sun Vigo, and takes a final toast before Jango puts a bolt in his head. The Slave One would transport the carcass to Hutt's palace, but as soon as he steps into the throne room, he sees the slug slouched over with eyes bulging out of his head. A voice comes from beside him, blaster raised to Jango's head. Whipping around, he sees none other than Zam Wesell. They trade threats at blaster point before it is revealed that they both killed each other's patron. The Hutt and Black Sun Vigo had contracts on each other. There was nothing to do now but walk away, and the closest thing to acknowledging their past and their tension is Zam's line, "The problem is that neither one of us wants to make the first move." Returning to Kamino, Boba exploded with happiness at the sight of his father, running to be embraced in his loving arms. Though another job calls, he promises to make time to play starships with the boy. The holo tells of a sizable bounty, and Jango is eager to make up for his deflating loss. He nearly rushes out the door, getting his helmet and telling Boba that leaving so soon doesn't mean that he loves him any less. But Boba is persistent and too sad to be left alone. The professional killer takes time to play with his son. Sometime later, he would enter the club on Coruscant to meet his benefactor. We see one of the problems that comes with galactic infamy. Losers will always try to bring down a hero to feel better about themselves. And in the bounty hunting world, this timeless trait is incentivized by the promise of more credits. And we see some anonymous hunters trying to make a name for themselves by killing the great Jango Fett. As you might have guessed, the first perp was dispatched in seconds, and the smaller guy gets made an example of, silencing the rest of the crowd. Entering the back room, he finds the Dug, who explains that the job is to retrieve an ancient artifact. One of Fett's rules is that he never takes a job if he doesn't know the employer, and when the Dug refuses to disclose this, his price doubles to 100,000. With this lead, Jango is off to the planet Salot. As he is setting the Slave One down, he gets in touch with the droid assistant on Kamino, checking in on how Boba was holding up with this jarring departure. And when the droid reports that he wasn't able to finish the upgrades on Jango's jetpack, we see that Fett kept alive another ancient Mandalorian tradition of animosity towards droids, angrily saying that he would sell him off for scrap if he wasn't so good at taking care of Boba. Reports say that a thief native to Salot had stolen the idol, and Jango guesses that he might want to reinstall it in their temple. As he makes his approach, we see that the ruins are enormous. Exploring deeper, the floors would crumble, sending Fett down into the abyss, but a quick launch of the whipcord saves his life. Pulling himself up, he sees that this commotion attracted a terrifying beast. He blasts away with the powerful Westar 34s, but this bug could take a punch, lashing out and sending the hunter crashing into a wall. Luckily, some handy explosives in his belt pouch save his skin. Dusting himself off, he gets up and starts to hear an odd language. Following this strange chanting, he comes upon a large, open space, dominated by a stone idol, and some stranger seeming to worship it. The being was unarmed, and Jango decides that he doesn't have to kill it, giving it a chance to hand the idol over. In a flash, the being would move its hands and send Jango flying away via some invisible force. This thing used the same sorcery as the Jedi, and in a split second, the blaster was out, the shot was made, and the being collapsed to the floor. With its dying breath, it switches to speaking in Basic, pleading with Jango to leave it, that the infant, the stone idol, must be placed back with the mother statue, for if the infant is angered, it can destroy worlds. While Jango is trying to process these dying words, he hears a familiar voice. Again, Zam was there with blaster raised. saying that she too was hired for the same job. So when she saw Jango, she figured she would just let him do the hard work and take the idol from him. Then it looked like her plan worked, until another massive bug pounced on her, and Jango runs off with the prize in hand. But his conscience gets the better of him. He wouldn't leave Zam behind. He rushes in blasting, tackling her free, and gets her to pop all the explosives she has, before leaping off the cliff to evade the blast and use the jetpack to fly to safety. And they land in a position that intensifies their flirtation, as they both acknowledge that the fates seem to be pushing them together. Back on Coruscant, he would deliver the idol and receive his pay, but Jango snaps on him, grabbing the Dug and pulling him close, threatening his life, saying that he didn't tell him that the target was force sensitive, and that he hired another hunter. He would kill Fernuda if he ever saw him again. When Jango came back home, Boba came rushing out to the landing pad, both Fetts embracing in the soaking rain, telling his son that nothing could drag him away this time. A couple days later, Zam would interrupt the Fetts while they were playing ball, and tell them that their job was not finished. She says that she was able to discover that the man behind the bounty understood that the idol was a sort of ancient weapon, a tool used by its Force-sensitive creators to create a rift in the Force. If placed in the right part of Coruscant, it could rip the planet apart, resulting in the deaths of trillions. Zam tells Jango that they were the ones that secured it. They need to fix it. No job, no credits, just because it's the right thing to do. First he says no and walks away, stating that his only responsibility is to his son, but Zam strikes a nerve, telling him to think of all the sons on Coruscant, and Jango tells her how he was saved by the Mandalorians, going somewhere dark as he thinks about how his life could have gone if it wasn't for Jaster Muriel. Zam would use her shape-shifting ability to impersonate Fernuda, the one that hired both of these hunters to track down the relic. But even with this perfect copy, nobody was revealing information on who had it now. She asked Jango where he would put a device to cause the most damage on Coruscant. He says that the power relays at the planet core could set off a chain reaction. As they set off to try and narrow down which relay specifically was going to be attacked, we can see that the lack of credits for this job was still really bothering Jango. Their target was a member of the Nudat Prime species called Korda. His strike team was able to covertly eliminate the Republic guards and had made their way into the reactor. The hunters followed the trails of blood as they got closer, and Jango pauses to tell Zam that this death cult and their leader scare him way more than Montross ever did. That Montross was a monster, but this was a madman. As the dark ritual sacrifice was initiated, Jedi Master Yariel Poof walks in to break up the party. Apparently, the Jedi had caught wind of this threat too, and as Korda turned to face the Jedi, the hunters came rushing in as well. Each of these warriors were able to kill several of the cultists with ease, but the raw energy of the reactor was activating this ancient Force weapon. Zam would be occupied by a Wookiee, but Fett spots Fernuda and tells him that he keeps his promises. He warned him that he'd kill the Dug if he ever saw him again, using his jetpack to drop in on him and start strangling the Dug. This mission really called on the deepest parts of Fett's sense of honor and duty. Working for no credits, and now even allied with the Jedi. As Fernuda was being choked, Master Poof was manipulating the idol to prevent the ritual. The Mandalorian sees Korda initiate the attack. Fett shouts out to try and warn the Jedi, but a blade goes right through his torso, the Jedi collapsing and the idol falling out of his grasp. Jango sprints towards it, but Zam was closer and able to use her shape-shifting ability to extend her reach. The cultists were all dead, but the idol was already activated. The Jedi Master says that they need to give it to him, that he could bind the destructive force to himself. Jango is suspicious, but it seems like their only hope. The Jedi brings it close to him and internalizes the rift caused in the Force, killing the Master while saving Coruscant. The hunters would then take the Slave One back to the ancient temple that once housed the idol, returning it, while Jango notes that just days earlier he had killed a being for doing just this. And Zam catches that this was the most notorious bounty hunter in the galaxy, admitting he felt something like guilt. When they turn around, they see that thousands of native Salots had silently encircled them, making Fett go to his blaster, but Zam is confident that they have come in peace. The Salot leader thanks them, but says not to return. Back on Kamino, Zam is unsuccessful at getting Jango to admit that he is not as cold as he let on, and gives him a payment of her own, a tender kiss on the cheek. But the moment is cut short by the young Boba Fett, who comes running and jumps into his father's arms. Even the boy notices the tension between these two hunters, and Papa Fett says that he expects he will see her soon. We are now in the year 22 BBY. In a few months, the galaxy will change forever with the opening of the Clone Wars. But right now, Jango is preparing the next generation. Boba was strapped into the jetpack, and in an enormous cave packed full of bones, his father sprays him with the scent of a local prey animal. And on cue, the Beleg, a creature larger and more terrifying than a crate dragon, barrels down on father and son. Boba's reactions are excellent, and as he soars out of the way, his father tells him that he can't leave until he brings back a tooth. Jango would calmly head outside, while Boba was flying through the cave system, a terrifying chase that could have cost Jango his legacy. But as he expected, Boba was victorious, if a little upset and confused. Jango tells his son that the lesson was that there would be moments where he would have no time to think or be afraid. He would have to act immediately to save his life. And this young boy had faced the most terrifying beast in the galaxy and survived. He should never be afraid of another living being again. As they leave this planet, they get hailed by Count Dooku. When the Sith sees that the boy is there, he tries to get some privacy, but Jango quickly cuts this off and says that he needs to speak freely in front of the kid. This is a bit surprising to the once Jedi, but he says that a man named Talos needs to be eliminated. He knows too much about the operation on Kamino. And when Dooku emphasizes that this target is dangerous, we see how proud Boba is, shouting out that no one is as dangerous as his dad. And the Count goes on to explain that he must be certain that this target does not realize who ordered this hit. As they race into the Ansari atmosphere, they are hailed by the traffic control ship, who explains that he will have to get clearance to land and pay the fee. But the Mandalorian simply responds by saying, "This is Jango Fett." The controller is annoyed and gives a very condescending response, quote, "Good for you, you know your own name," which sends his partner into a panic, grabbing the comm system and frantically trying to save the situation, explaining that his partner was new, and that all Fett would have to do is just provide identification, which the Slave One promptly supplies in the form of a pair of missiles. On the landing pad, Boba would plead to be able to do more than simply defend the ship. Jango reminds him that even with the notorious reputation of Fett, one could always be surprised by stupid people. Someone might come for the ship, but the boy had a point. In this case, he could use Boba's help. With his legacy in his arms, he would soar above the city and set down over the Mark's residence. Identifying the target's window, he sets up the blaster rifle. Boba says that if they know he's in there, they should just go in guns blazing. But Jango says that non-confrontational ways must always be taken first. The fact that this was barely more than an hour out from him fighting the Beleg monster was shocking to Boba, but his father is trying to point out that these are different mindsets and skills for different threats and situations. And so Jango would not be the one staring down the scope, it would be his boy, who was now 10 years old. And with patience, he finally sees his target. Calmly, he pulls the trigger, and the bolt flies through the window and into the helmet. A direct hit, but that armor saved the target's life, forcing Jango to rush in to finish the job. The target gets a jump on him, but Fett is able to flip his blaster pistol around and get a blast off into the man's torso. This close range with that powerful Westar 34 was getting through almost any armor. As the man bleeds out, he keeps saying that he knows Jango. The hunter doesn't care, but the man insists and proceeds to remove his helmet. And Jango sees that the face of this dying man was his own. Stunned, Fett can only get out the words, "A clone." Jango has to know more, and his target explained that he escaped from the army. He wanted to choose his own destiny. The contract killer is unimpressed. The clone looks into his creator's eyes while asking if Jango can shoot himself. Fett's response is, "Could you do it?" And when the reply is no, he fires, the powerful bolt melting through the face, skull, and brain of the man that was nearly genetically identical to him. And as he turns away, he says, "That's because you're not me." Meaning the true Jango Fett knew he was capable of turning the blaster on himself, and that this also proved that he and the clones were not the same, not true copies of him, not ruthless enough to carry on his legacy. As he picks up his helmet, he hears a commotion and spins, blaster raised. A human woman and child are huddled, terrified and confused. Why did this killer have her husband's face? Jango wants to see the child, who is named Connor Freeman. The baby's big bright eyes looking up to the killer and trying to call him dad. Fett is shaken by this, but composes himself and walks away. She begs him for answers, but he says that it's because she does not know that she gets to live, flying off to be with his true son, his true legacy. When Boba calls him dad, we see that he is still coming to terms with this mission. Even his son can tell something is off, and it is a quiet flight back to the Slave One. Jango would stare off into the stormy night, while Boba is still trying to get his dad to come back to himself. His father says only, quote, "It's a nasty business sometimes, but it is just business. We don't make this personal." And to cheer his boy up, he tells Boba that he can pilot the ship and take them wherever he wanted to go in the whole galaxy, that they had earned some much needed R&R. The only thing Jango says to address the mission is that they will talk about it later. but the mystery of this night would always haunt Boba. We learn that decades later he was still troubled by it, Boba noting that they never did get to have that talk. Though Boba would try to rectify things with Connor at one point, explaining to him that it was not his true clone father that left him his big inheritance, but that was Jango, who was so torn by this mission that he returned to impersonate Connor's father and open a fund for the boy to draw on later in life. The next mission would come from Tyrannus, who needed to prevent the fall of the Fondor system, with Fondor shipyards needing to be one of the major shipwrights for the Republic during the Clone Wars and during the subsequent Empire. Sidious personally called for Tyrannus to send his bounty hunter after Grudo the Hutt, and his accomplices Senator Rod and droid engineer Hurlo Holowan. But Wat Tambor had given the same target list to the Trandoshan team Kratos and Bossk. During the hunt, Bossk would capture Boba, and though Jango would be able to free his son, this close call worried him so much that he feared continuing on with the mission until the boy could be brought back to the safety of Kamino. To not lose the momentum of the chase, Fett called on Zam Wesell to follow up on his leads. And eventually the mission would lead to an alliance with Aurra Sing, who was hunting the same Hutt for her own personal vendetta, and together this assemblage of hunters were able to bring in all three of the targets, Jango delivering them to Dooku on Geonosis before departing for another contract. The Trade Federation hired him to track down a Toydarian by the name of Rudy. His pirate activities over the planet Marramir got Jango sent after him. And although we do know that the Slave One caught up with him, unleashing a barrage of fire, it is unclear if the Toydarian survived. The next contract would also be from the Trade Federation, and it would prove to be the final contract of Jango's life. For the past 10 years, Nute Gunray had been trying to eliminate the woman who thwarted all of his plans, and expose the Trade Federation. Sidious also needed the Senator out of the picture, as she was one of the most powerful voices for peace, surely to vote against the creation of the Grand Army of the Republic. To make sure this happened, they hired the best bounty hunter in the galaxy to finally finish off Padme. But Jango knew how difficult this would be. This job would involve the Senate security, the Jedi, and the Naboo Royal Guard, which had thwarted assassination attempts for a decade. This was a job best left to be subcontracted, just so it wasn't tracked back to him. And so again he called on Zam Wesell. She would strike while the Senator's ship landed, but a body double thwarted this attack. Jango would meet with Zam to give her another option, and stress the importance of this mission.
We'll have to try something more subtle this time, Zam. My client is getting impatient.
When this too was stopped and the Jedi showed how tenacious they were, Jango was forced to make a difficult decision. He watched this entire saga play out, his changeling subcontractor trying to escape in the crowd of a bar, only to be captured and taken outside for interrogation by these sorcerers. Zam was tough. When he saw she was about to crack and reveal his name, he had to make the right business decision. Nothing personal, as the saber dart raced in from a nearby rooftop, hitting her in the neck and injecting the poison that would kill Zam in seconds. After all their missions together, being the woman Roz once hoped would become Mrs. Fett, and the only woman Boba had ever seen be close with his father, she would die an excruciating death, as Jango Fett soared away to safety. Perhaps Jango believed that the Kamino saber dart was so untrackable that there would be no clues for the Jedi to work with. The Jedi's database, which was the most thorough in the entire galaxy, could not identify it. And even when Kenobi learned that it was from Kamino, he found that according to his database, no such planet existed. No object was even recorded in this space, which was completely mapped. But Jango underestimated the mind and drive of Kenobi, an act that would eventually lead to his death, as the Jedi refused to let this lead go cold, heading out to where the planet should be and discovering an enormous secret. Even before the Jedi would meet Fett, he was given a tour of the facility and looked at the faces of hundreds of thousands of clone troopers that all shared the same face. And we see that even the cloners thought that the story of Boba Fett was odd, offering up that detail without Kenobi even asking about the pay.
Fett demanded only one thing, an unaltered clone for himself. Curious, isn't it?
Coming to the Fett's quarters, we see that Boba had picked up his father's disgust of Jedi, giving Kenobi a harsh look over before letting him in. Taun We would introduce the Jedi, and when Kenobi tries to compliment the army, Jango gives the first of many short and disarming comments.
I'm just a simple man trying to make my way in the universe.
As the conversation goes on, Boba can sense the tension, turning to speak to his son in Fett code once Kenobi drops the name Sifo-Dyas. Boba will go and shut the door to the room containing his father's distinct Mandalorian armor, Jango subtly trying to get the Jedi's gaze off of the suit by walking to the other side of him. Questions keep coming, and Fett gives a surprisingly true answer.
I was recruited by a man called Tyrannus on one of the moons of Bogdan.
Curious.
But Kenobi doesn't buy it. Boba is trying to keep up with this conversational form of battle, and Jango changes the subject back to the army.
They'll do their job well. I'll guarantee that.
giving one sarcastic parting shot as Kenobi leaves.
Always a pleasure to meet a Jedi.
Boba can sense that his father is deeply concerned about something. His father gives no further explanation, but knows when he had been outmaneuvered, knows when to retreat and strategize.
Pack your things. We're leaving.
As the Fetts prepare their escape, Kenobi was talking with the Council, and when they agree that this bounty hunter must be further questioned, the Jedi rushes to intercept them. Wearing the armor Kenobi saw that night on Coruscant, both knew this battle would no longer be with words. Lightsaber activated, and the blasters come out.
Boba, get on board!
And we see he would use the same strategy he picked up fighting Kamari Vosa. The first volley of bolts would be deflected, as Jango let the sorcerer come closer, before activating his jetpack to get the high ground. With this advantage, Obi-Wan is outpositioned and forced to roll, the Westar 34's enormous blast nearly taking his life. Boba was already moving the ship into position to help his dad, the distraction buying Jango a chance to let off a missile, which strikes right at the Jedi's feet, sending him flying through the air, only to be followed up with a blast from the Slave One. These two masters of the high ground knew how to counter the advantage, Obi-Wan intercepting Jango with a powerful kick that dislodged one of his blasters, and then Jango intercepting Kenobi's kick, flipping the Jedi onto his back. They would trade a series of blows before we see tech versus mysticism. The Mandalorian flying up with his jetpack, calling down his viewfinder, and delivering a perfect shot with the whipcord, while Obi-Wan used the Force to call the blade back into his hands. The Mandalore getting the millisecond advantage that would make all the difference, dragging the helpless sorcerer around the platform. But this Jedi was not like the others, proving his unique tenacity again by using a pull to bring Fett crashing down, destroying the jetpack and following up this momentum with another kick, only inches away from taking a bolt at close range. This single shot was all the hunter could get off before the pair went sliding over the edge. Jango's tech saved him once more, blade shooting out of his gauntlet, allowing him to dig into the metal plating, and with a press of the button, the whipcord was released, Jango assuming the Jedi had fallen to his death. He would walk back to his ship and to his son, as Kenobi returned with just seconds to spare, able to get a tracking device attached to the Slave One. Moments later, we see the Fetts had run to Geonosis to rendezvous with Count Dooku. Kenobi was right behind them in his Delta 7 Jedi starfighter. Boba is the first one to notice.
Dad! I think we're being tracked!
And Kenobi is greeted with one of the most unique, deadly, and beautiful weapons in the galaxy. This was a brilliant move, as the blue blast turned the already dangerous asteroids into billions of little rocks that would be shotgunned out in all directions. A great threat to the smaller and more fragile Delta 7. But when Fett saw that this didn't work, it was followed up with an unrelenting flurry of laser cannon bolts that pushed Kenobi to call deeply on the Force to try and stay ahead of this deadly red stream. But eventually it proves too much, and a bolt strikes the wing.
We got him!
We'll just have to finish him.
Now it was time for the missiles, and as it locked on and hunted its target down, Obi-Wan had to fake his own death, releasing a cloud of tools just as he passed through a narrow opening, and then cutting off his engine systems to avoid detection from sensors. This quick thinking tricks the most skilled hunter in the galaxy.
Well, we won't be seeing him again.
And father and son would take their ship down to one of the Geonosian hangars. The following day, we see that Count Dooku had captured Kenobi, and reluctantly had to sentence him to death in the arena, along with his captured allies Anakin Skywalker and Padme Amidala. Jango would be there alongside the Count and Nute Gunray, a convoluted but acceptable path to seeing the Senator's death, this contract finally being fulfilled. But when the prisoners break free and make the show their own, Nute gets nervous.
Jango! Finish her off!
Patience, Viceroy, patience, she will die.
And Tyrannus knows there is no way they could escape the droid army. But the next second would see a purple blade raised to Jango's neck. Boba is terrified, while his father somehow remains cool and collected, just looking for his chance to escape, as the entire arena sees hundreds of lightsabers ignited. Once the B-2 battle droids come stomping in at Mace, this gives Fett the chance to slip away, blasting at the Jedi with the flamethrower as Window is pushed into the arena. Full-scale battle erupts between the Force wielders and droid units, while the bounty hunter stays as bodyguard to his benefactor. Coleman Trebor would drop down on Dooku, hoping to cut down this fallen Jedi, but the Count doesn't even blink, fully confident in Jango's skill, as the Mandalorian pulls his blaster and gets a bolt off to knock the saber back, and then beats back his guard with the sheer power of the Westar 34, opening up Trebor's side to a bolt that would send him flying over the edge. A quick gun spin to celebrate the death of a Jedi, one of the best feelings in the galaxy. And we also see that Jango never recovered the second blaster that was lost on Kamino. Drunk off of this victory, he sees that a reek had just rushed Master Windu. This sorcerer would pay for putting a saber up to the neck of Jango Fett, the Mandalore. As he comes down, he sees the Reek knock the blade away, and Fett goes to jump for it. Perhaps against his own rules, he took Mace's attack too personally, infuriated at the idea that this Jedi had snuck up on him, and threatened to decapitate him in front of his son. That could not be accepted. While Fett could have just shot him here, it seems he wanted the chance to kill a Jedi with his own blade. Imagine if the man who spread fears through the Order, with tales of him killing 6 Jedi with his own hands, was able to strike down Mace Windu with his own blade. But Mace is calm as the Force delivers the blade back into his hand, while Jango is now out of position, laying face down in the sand as the Reek now charges him. The beating by horn and hooves would damage the jetpack, but Fett is able to take the beast down with a single bolt to the head. He turns to Mace to use the same Jedi high ground tactic used against Kamari Vosa and Kenobi. Let him rush in, soar above him, and fire down. But if you look close, you can see that Jango did activate his jetpack, but the damage caused them to short circuit, providing nothing but a shower of sparks and poof of smoke. While the Jedi carried through his attack seamlessly, severing the blaster, and then Jango Fett's head. The greatest bounty hunter in the history of the profession was now dead. The death of the Mandalore, and the final survivor from the true Mandalorians. And his legacy looked on, consumed by a combination of shock, anger, and sadness. Boba's only friend and only family member was now gone in an instant. When the battle moved on, opening up the Clone Wars that would forever change the galaxy, Jango was having one last silent moment with his father, staring into the helmet that struck fear and respect across the galaxy. The boy knew what he had to become. He would dig his father a grave and leave this simple inscription in the sand, JF. The armor would be collected, and over time he would come to learn more about his father's origins, his connections to the true Mandalorians, and how his father was so driven to carry on the legacy of Jaster Muriel. Boba would take up the sigil of the Mandalorian Protectors, worn once by his biological grandfather, and previously by the man who came to adopt Jango into the Mando culture. Even the coloring of the suit of armor would now reflect this formative time in his father's life. Bounty hunters around the world mourned, and though some would celebrate this as a chance to rise, deep down they still respected Jango Fett, a man who was the greatest at what he did. The arena he once fought a crate dragon in would be renamed Jango Fett Arena, though some Mandalorians like Olmec, the pacifist new Mandalorian faction in power, tried to distance his culture from the likes of the notorious killer.
Jango Fett was a common bounty hunter. How he acquired that armor is beyond me.
This was clearly just to appease the Republic's representative in the form of Kenobi. But Spar, the clone that Jango helped escape Kamino all those years ago, would rise to become Mandalore the Resurrector. And in his fight against the new Mandalorian faction, people were retelling the heroic tales of Jango Fett, bringing a sense of pride to a new generation of Mandalorian. Years later, Boba would become the new Mandalore, and in this role his appreciation for his Mandalorian culture was deepened. He would bring his father's remains to the planet Mandalore, placing them in a grave right next to Boba's deceased daughter, the granddaughter that Jango never got to meet. And perhaps in this role, he would find out that the Fett's roots stretch back all the way to the time of the Old Republic with Cassius Fett, who himself nearly became the Mandalore thousands of years earlier. While Boba Fett carried on Jango's legacy in a way greater than he could have ever dreamed, in a way, Jango also got his own revenge on the Jedi Order from beyond the grave, as it would be the eyes of Jango Fett that saw the fear and panic in the final moments of thousands of Jedi's lives. The Order of Sorcerers that had killed all of his true Mandalorian allies, destroyed his Mando Order. Jango's clones would bring an end to the Jedi Order, firmly securing Jango's place in the History Hollows. An achievement that would make him one of, if not the most powerful and important Mandalorians to ever live. And that is the complete legend of Jango Fett.
I'm not a murderer, but I want justice.
Our mission commander, an expert on the inner workings of Kamino, was a young bounty hunter named Boba Fett.
They'll do.
What's up, Meta Nerds? This video will cover each and every detail from the life of Boba Fett, from before his birth to his legacy after death, stories from dozens of comics, novels, shows, and movies over the decades. If you like this video, please hit the like button to help promote it, and subscribe so you don't miss anything, as this will be a multi-part epic saga on the complete legend of Boba Fett. The course of Boba's life was set long before he was born. Decades before the first clone was created on Kamino, the Mandalorians were deep into their latest civil war. The new Mandalorians were the pacifists, and were the largest and most politically powerful faction, enabling them to take the throne of Mandalore. But within the warrior Mandos, there was even further fracturing, splitting into Death Watch led by Vizsla, and the true Mandalorians led by Jaster Mareel. Jango Fett was just a boy when the Civil War brought death and destruction to his homeworld of Concord Dawn. Jango's mother and father were beaten and executed, while his sister was captured, twisted into a weapon, and driven insane, before being left to rot in an asylum. Boba would be able to get away and ran straight into the arms of Jaster Mareel. And over the years, he would grow to be the most respected Mandalorian amongst the ranks. But his adopted father would be cut down on what was supposed to be a routine mission, making Jango the Mandalore, before he would eventually lose all of his men and become a bounty hunter. And decades later, Jango's closest friend, a Toydarian bounty broker named Roz, was able to identify a lot of Jango's psychological hang-ups.
You ever think maybe you hang on to that ship, those memories, because you're looking for someone to take under your own wing?
And shortly after this conversation, he would lose her as well, Roz's dying words encouraging him to find meaning.
Just find something to live for besides the money. You deserve more.
Moments later, he would complete the bounty placed by Lord Tyrannus, which had the dual purpose of finding one worthy of being the clone template. This is just moments after Roz's death, and Jango is adamant that he wants the first clone to be unaltered in any way, and to be given to him. This child would become Jaster's legacy. Before he was even born, the mantle of Mandalore was placed on Boba. Under Jango's rule as Mandalore, all of the true Mandalorians had died in an epic battle with the Jedi, and he desperately wanted to ensure that that honorable warrior culture, which had saved him and given his life purpose, did not blink out of existence with his own death. Boba would be the final hope for the Mandalorian people. In 32 BBY, Boba Fett would be spawned in the Kaminoan labs, and while his altered brothers would grow at twice the rate, Jango would balance raising his infant and an army. Years would go by, and we can see how difficult it was for Boba to have this single and incredibly busy parent, as Jango was still taking bounties, and the boy was often raised by various droids and sometimes the Kaminoan Taun We. He would have no friends his age, and did not attend anything like a school. But he was a voracious, self-guided learner, simply pulling whatever data pads he wished from the Kaminoan library, especially on the mechanics of starfighters. And though his father was drawn by so many forces, they still had an excellent relationship. Young Boba loved to play starfighters with his father, and was always keeping an eye out for Slave One, rushing out into the soaking rain to jump up into his father's arms. And Jango was known to tell Cal Scarata, one of the sergeants he had training the clones, that Boba was worth more to him than all of the credits and reputation that he had earned. And when Zam Wesell wanted to get Jango to help him on a mission of conscience, not credits, she knew to pull on the strings of fatherhood, getting Jango to help save Coruscant by making the professional killer think about how many sons like Boba were on that world. You can honestly say that Coruscant may have been destroyed if it wasn't for how Jango was transformed by this love of his son. By the time Boba was 10 years old, we see that he was deep into his warrior training. On an unidentified planet, he would be strapped into a jetpack and sprayed with the scent of a local prey animal. A bit of flying practice as he had to evade the enormous Bayleg by zipping around in a cave and break off its tooth before he could leave. Boba was panicked, confused, and angry, but what mattered most was that he was successful. His father tells him that he was forced to trust his instincts and reactions, having no time for fear. And since he had taken on the largest and most frightening monster in the galaxy, he should never be afraid of any other being. Moments later, we would see how Jango wanted to include his son on every aspect of the business, telling Dooku to speak freely in front of the boy. And we see just how fiercely proud Boba was of his father, yelling at the Count that his dad was more dangerous than any target out there. Once they do get to the location, Boba is happily surprised to hear that he will be the one taking the shot, though he is confused why they don't just burst in with brute force. Jango stresses that the Bayleg Cave and this hit are different situations that need different methods. Always try to use the least confrontational method when possible. Boba would patiently stare down the scope until his target came home. Calmly, he would pull the trigger, sending the perfectly placed bolt that collided with the Mark's helmet. But it did not kill the man, forcing Jango to fly in and finish the fight. A battle that would reveal that their target was a runaway clone. Jango is stunned, but knows if he is to be the sole ruler, the Mandalore, he needs to be strong enough to pull the blaster on himself, blowing away the man who shared his face. When his father returns, Boba can sense that something is off, scared at how his powerful dad could be this shaken. As they pull away, Jango says that Boba could pilot the Slave One, and that one day he would explain what had so disturbed him. The next mission would teach Boba the art of deception, as they were contracted to eliminate rebels on Kuat. Boba would stumble into their camp, feinting to be weak and lost. In front of these blaster-wielding warriors, he would stall, until he revealed a thermal detonator, his father's words in his mind as he chucks the explosive into the camp and runs back into another tent, huddled there while Jango blasts away all the rebel forces. But their leader discovers Boba and has a fearful but honest conversation with him, explaining how the overlords of Kuat were oppressing the people, and even his own son had been consumed by their industrial machine that reduced people to replaceable cogs. But Boba recants some of Jango's wisdom as he waits, that he should never be concerned with politics or emotions. When Jango arrives, the rebel puts a blaster to Boba's head, but when the boy says, quote, "Only a son can know his father's heart," the man releases Boba, but Jango snatches his son up and tosses an explosive at the leader, the blast consuming the tent as they soar away via jetpack. Boba feels bad for the man and asks his father why, while he also knows that his father will not explain anything until the mission was completed. When Jango reports in to Count Dooku, we see that the Sith was interested in the boy's progress as a warrior, having his own plans for the future of Fett. And we see Boba struggling with the morality of this profession. He explains to his father that this man was simply defending his son's honor, and the countless sons of Kuat. And Jango agrees that he was right to look into the motives of his target, but that his only loyalty is to his word. Once you had committed to an action, the battlefield will leave no room for mercy. Boba thinks to himself that he knows what his father's heart contained. It was also his heart, understanding that this was the way of the warrior. But their next mission together would have a setback. Tyrannus had contacted Jango to capture a hut that was orchestrating a takeover of the Fondor system, a system that contained the great Fondor shipyards, which would play a useful role in the Clone Wars and under Imperial rule. Jango allowed his son to accompany him, but the boy was captured by the rival hunters Kradusk and Bosk. Though Fett was able to get Boba back, he was so shaken by this mission that he cut it short in order to take him back to Kamino, calling on Zamwazel to follow up on his leads. His father would have one more mission after this before being contracted to eliminate Senator Padme Amidala. Kenobi would be able to track Jango down to Kamino, and it would be a young Boba that opens the door to the Fett suite. The closest thing he could ever compare to a mother was Taun We, and she was happy to introduce the Jedi to the clone template. But we see the boy already disdained these sorcerers, giving Kenobi a harsh look over before letting him in. As Jango finds a way to avoid the root of the Jedi's every question, Boba looks on entranced, trying to learn this form of verbal warfare, giving up answers without giving any information, before his dad tells him to shut the door to the armory, speaking to him in their Fett code language.
Boba, Rudet Sohik.
It would be more conversational combat, and as the Jedi leaves, Boba can sense that his dad is truly worried.
What is it, Dad?
Pack your things. We're leaving.
He would have only a few minutes to pack up and leave the only home he had ever known, rushing off to one of the rain-covered platforms to load up the Slave One. But they are intercepted by the Jedi.
Dad! No!
Boba, get on board!
Though he was only 10 years old, he was trained enough in the warrior ways to hop right into the fight, whipping the Slave One around to blast at this sorcerer. The father-son team provided an incredible challenge to Kenobi, while the boy looked on proudly while Jango delivered his blows, eventually returning to the platform victorious. They would take off and set a course for Geonosis, but Obi-Wan was hot on their trail, and it is the young co-pilot that notices the Delta 7 fighter first.
Dad! I think we're being tracked!
There was not a shred of worry in the boy, fully confident in his father's piloting skills and Slave One's power. As the Jedi is greeted with the glorious seismic charge, then the furious streams of laser cannons, and seeming to end the fight with a missile, before the Fets made their way down to the surface. Dooku had come to expect the young boy at the professional killer's side, and Boba would be with his father as they headed to the Petranaki arena. The Jedi had survived the battle in orbit, but Tyrannus assured Jango that the Jedi and the senator that he was contracted to kill would all die to the cheers of thousands of Geonosians. But things did not go as planned, and the greatest bounty hunter in the galaxy was snuck up on by Mace Windu, Boba looking on helplessly as the purple blade was just millimeters from his father's neck, while his father was calm, just waiting for the opportunity to escape. And salvation came in the form of B-2 battle droids. As they opened fire, Jango stepped aside and blasted with his flamethrower, Boba trying to process the chaos that had just erupted in the arena. He would see his father defend the Count with some blasts from his powerful Westar 34s, and when Jango saw Mace being pursued by a Reek, he flies down via jetpack and sees that the beast had knocked the Jedi's lightsaber free, perhaps out of a wish to kill the Jedi with his own saber, something that would certainly add to his infamy. He forgoes simply shooting the wizard, instead he leaps out to grab the blade, but the Force was a slippery foe. Mace calls the weapon back to his hand and confidently rises to face Fett. The Mandalore's error was compounded by the charging Reek, but Boba looked on as his father killed this monster and was eager to see the death of this Jedi. But Jango did not notice that his jetpack had been severely damaged, and though he wished to use the move that helped him to get the high ground against Kamari Vosa and Kenobi, when he activated the jets, they short-circuited, providing only a poof of smoke, while Mace moved through his lightsaber form seamlessly. And Boba looks on as his father is decapitated, his head flying out of the helmet and onto the first battlefront of the Clone Wars. Dooku was shocked, but Boba was absolutely devastated, losing the only friend and only family that he had ever known. With the death of his father, Boba's previous life ended as well. As the battle moved on, he would make his way into the arena and stare into the helmet that came to symbolize his father, the last of the true Mandalorians, and in that instant he knew what he had to become. Gathering up the armor and burying his father in a simple grave in the arena, leaving only the humble letters J.F. drawn in the sand. The end to the greatest Mandalore in thousands of years. Boba knew he would have to carry on his father's legacy, Jaster's legacy, in the warrior code of the Mandalorians. But first, he was set on getting his revenge on Mace Windu. And to guide him, he would refer to a book that his father left him in Slave One, a book Jango composed in order to teach the boy from beyond the grave, always knowing that this lifestyle had the threat of an abrupt death. This book would provide him guidance in everything from warrior philosophy to locations and contracts for every situation that might arise. Fett would take Slave One to Kamino, but saw that the Jedi had now infested the planet. And when he contacted Aurra Sing, she turned him over to Darth Tyrannus, who wanted to ensure that the boy grew to be a powerful assassin loyal to him. Sing would be given the Slave One as a reward, but Boba would not stay the Sith's captive for long. A Republic attack on Raxus Prime to stop Dooku's use of the Force Harvester inadvertently gave the boy a chance to slip away, running into the arms of clone troopers, saved by those beings who shared his father's face. The Republic forces sent Boba to an orphanage on Bespin, where he could have spent years wallowing in obscurity if Aurra Sing didn't come to the rescue. It was easy to make it seem like she thought that bringing the boy to Dooku was in his best interest, and he wouldn't understand this at the time, but she was just using him to access a large sum of credits that were in Jango's name, taking the boy directly from Bespin to a banking clan-ruled planet of Argal. Here, the young Boba would be tricked by the changeling named Nuri, who impersonated a banking official to siphon off credits from naive visitors. The account that Boba received was likely in the millions, because what the Claudite took was 500,000 credits. This fraction was more than what most crooks would ever see in a lifetime. And though just a 10-year-old orphan, his instincts were good enough to make him suspicious of Sing. So after he got his credits, he was able to escape with the Slave One and leave her behind before she was able to join in on the theft of his inheritance. Referring to his father's book, he saw that he could trust a certain Jabba the Hutt on the outer rim world of Tatooine, and set the coordinates to a place that he hoped to be able to call home. Here he would have a run-in with the Jedi bounty hunter Dirge, who wanted to wipe Mandalorians from the galaxy. But Jabba's patronage protected the boy at this incredibly vulnerable time, feeling a great gratitude towards Jango for taking out Gardulla the Hutt, which helped Jabba to take complete control of Tatooine. Jabba's palace would act as a sort of home base for Boba for the rest of his life, often returning here in between contracts, and of course to get new bounties. But this is where he would hatch his plan to get revenge. Though he worried Sing might betray him, and he had once been captured by Bosk, he referred to his father's book of advice, seeking a way to win friends and influence killers. He knew not to take their betrayal too personal. It was only business in this new power vacuum without his father, and it was his responsibility to defend himself. Then he also knew that these hunters would be motivated by credits, and that they did genuinely respect his father, while in Sing's case they shared a burning hatred for the Jedi Order. These two agreed that they would help the boy kill Mace Windu, crafting a complex plan that would see the first clone created reunited with his clone brethren. Boba would infiltrate the Clone Youth Brigade and take the nickname Lucky, but when he gives his backstory, some of the other cadets call him a coward.
A real trooper could lose an arm and still report for duty. So what are you, soft?
Though one of the boys makes sure to stand up for him.
So trooper's only as strong as the trooper beside him. We're all in it together, right?
Right.
When they arrive on the Venator Endurance, they are met by Anakin Skywalker and Mace Windu. Everyone's excited to be working with the Jedi, except for Boba, whose mind goes to a dark place upon seeing Mace. Their first task would be some target practice, and after cadet failed, Lucky steps up to show him how it's done, taking out the first target with a single shot, and then a trio of targets with ease. Accuracy that even surprises the gunner and admiral. After this, the cadets head out to their next task, but Boba finds a chance to slip off. and contacts Singh to put their assassination plan into motion.
Boba, is that you?
It is.
I'm sending you the data now.
As he makes his way down the corridors, he bumps into a pair of clones, who seem to know that he's an imposter.
You're lying.
But they were just trying to scare him, and tell him that he was going the wrong way. Mace's quarters were in the other direction. He arrives at the location and gets to work placing a tripwire in the doorway. He completed the process, and as he makes his way back to the cadets, he bumps into the man that had killed his father just a few months ago. Though burning with rage, he is still able to control himself, expecting that he was just moments away from vengeance. It is only a trooper's persistence that saves the Jedi's life, urging Mace to report to a meeting immediately while he goes to place Mace's things in the room. The first step over the threshold would trigger the explosives, the blast consuming the quarters and sending shrapnel flying. Mace is safe and tries to save the life of the trooper, though he would succumb to his injuries. The first of Boba's unintended victims. He'd be able to make his way back to the cadets just in time to answer a question posed by his commander. No one detected his absence, providing him cover as the alarm sounds, and they all rush into position as the ship frantically tries to figure out what happened. Boba overhears the CO get a report that Windu had survived, and waits for a chance to break away and contact Singh for advice on what to do next. She says he must set the reactor to explode, and we see that he worries about the thousands of innocent lives on board.
But the crew, it isn't about them, just Mace.
If you want Windu dead, do as I say.
This is the first of many acts that would pull him away from his Mando code of honor, but the 10-year-old Boba feels there was no other option. Once inside the main reactor, he is discovered by a trooper, who believes his story that he's just lost, and with a seemingly harmless interest in the blaster, the trooper hands it over to the lad while speaking on the comms. Boba knows this was the chance. He swings the rifle at the trooper's head, but it doesn't knock him out, so he follows up with another blow, which sends the clone to the ground, and the kid raises the blaster.
We're brothers! Don't shoot!
You're not my brother.
He hates being compared to these clones, but still bound by honor, he did not kill the trooper, just stuns him, and proceeded to blast the control systems and reactor casings, before running back through the corridors and rejoining the cadets. The ship experienced critical system failures and was on a crash course for the planet Florum. The crew packs onto escape pods and jettisons off in all directions, and Boba was able to secretly cut off all the sensors, making their pod undetectable by Republic allies, while Boba still had a direct line to Aurra Sing. Moments later, Slave One comes to intercept.
Congratulations, Boba.
The cadets are disgusted by their brother's betrayal, something they thought impossible. But we also see Boba is distraught. He still wishes to act honorably, as his father did.
What do you think?
Let them go?
They're living witnesses, honey.
Boba makes the difficult decision to send them off, upon Singh's intense urgings.
Do it!
And he presses the button to send the pod floating off into space, while the hunters safely fly away on the Slave One. Luckily for the cadets, their pod is discovered by Mace and Anakin, saving the boys before their life support systems went out. And we see all of Boba's near-identical copies trying to process this betrayal.
If he is like us, he'll realize he's wrong.
In what was only a few months earlier, what now seemed like another life, Jango had killed a clone trooper who claimed that he and Fett were the same, proving that the clone was no true copy, not ruthless enough. And this mission would see Boba torn between a want to prove that he was as cutthroat as necessary, and yet still trying to honor his father's wishes for him to carry on the Mandalorian warrior code of honor. The following day, the hunters would intercept Republic transmissions that the Jedi would be heading to the crash site in search of Admiral Killian, who went down with the Venator. After a lengthy search through the wreckage, Anakin sees a Mandalorian helmet in the command bridge. Curiosity consumes him and he moves to inspect it, but Mace is putting it all together.
Boba.
Anakin, no!
At the last second, Mace calls on the Force to rip Anakin back as the blast goes off, the explosion consuming the bridge, while the hunters watched on from a nearby mountain range.
Are you happy now?
Instead of elation, the boy is still full of rage and wants to confirm his kill.
I want to make sure he's dead.
There's nothing left of Windu to find, Boba.
Singh wasn't just less honorable, she was sloppy. His father always told him to never assume anything. As they head over to their ship, their hired hand Castus starts complaining about how hard this mission was, and shows he did not understand who exactly this boy was.
You haven't even done anything. I've taken all the risks.
Quiet, rot.
Even though she had betrayed him plenty, Singh would not let Jango's son be disrespected by the likes of Castus. and when they discuss how much credits they would get for the Admiral and the officers, Boba points out that they could use this mission for vengeance to secure a nice paycheck as well.
Count Dooku will pay us well if we bring back the Jedi's head.
Dooku might pay us for killing Windu.
In this interaction, we see the complicated relationships between Boba and Sing. She definitely is the more powerful one, ordering around Boba and Bossk, but she still recognizes his intellect and respects Boba's input. Neither she nor Bossk thought about how to get the most credits out of this mission. And so the hunters would race towards the Venator, while R2 was desperately trying to free the Jedi from the collapsed bridge wreckage. Mace and Anakin were pinned, and the astromech would have to fight his way out with an excellent display of droid creativity. These attacks by R2 force the hunters to leave, and when the droid tries to make it back to their starfighter to contact the Council, a fight with a Gundark resulted in an explosion that alerted Boba. He thinks it must be the Jedi, so they jam all outgoing transmissions, forcing the astromech to take Mace's ship and try to make it back to Coruscant. The hunters scramble to intercept in the Slave One, and R2 shows off some amazing piloting skills and his own droid intelligence, activating both hyperspace rings and drawing fire to the one while darting over to the other at the last second.
I've got you, Windu. No!
Boba's accuracy was great, but this maneuver allowed R2 to escape. In Slave One, we see that Boba is ready to take his rage out on Castus, and that Sing is still the one calling the shots, saying that she could use these prisoners to make Windu come to them, but for now they need to flee. Moments later, we see Boba is still uncomfortable with this honorless mission. What was supposed to be vengeance has turned into indiscriminate killing and torturing of innocents. He goes to bring the captives water and explain that this was not his intention.
This isn't what I wanted.
I know a good soldier when I see one.
I'm no soldier. I'm no clone, not like those two. What? What are you looking at?
Boba.
Jango worked hard to make his son understand that he alone would be his legacy, that Boba was unique, not just another one of those millions of mass-produced tools. He will never accept the assertion that they are brothers. Sing thinks that this was the perfect time to contact the Jedi and make their demands. Use the boy's rage at this comment to ensure that he will become a killer, pushing him to execute an innocent officer.
Boba!
Remember, Boba had killed before, and intended to kill, but those were for what he saw as honorable missions, taking out targets that had been contracted, sticking to his word and the warrior code. What Aurra Sing saw as weakness, Boba knew he was keeping in line with the honorable Mandalorian way. In the temple, we see that Windu is ready to go challenge these hunters, but Plo steps in and says that he is the last person that should go. There would be no talking the boy out of this life. Windu's presence would only bring up the boy's sadness and anger. And in Slave One, we see how furious Sing is with Boba.
Next time I tell you to pull the trigger, you do it.
They would make their way to Florum, home of the Pirate King Hondo Ohnaka, who gives his condolences to Boba and shows how deeply many in the underworld respected his dad.
Sorry about your father. He was a friend and an honorable man.
As they make their way inside his cantina, we see that Sing still looks out for the boy's interests, stopping him from taking a drink. And when she overhears Crastus trying to betray them over a holocall, she callously turns and blasts him. Boba staring remorsefully. As annoying as the guy was, this was another death that he didn't want on his hands. Plo Koon would take Padawan Tano with him down to the lower levels of Coruscant, to a place known associates of Jango Fett would frequent. In the bar, Tano was able to calm her mind, and here's a criminal telling an associate how his friend was killed on Florum by Aurra Sing. Now with their location, the Jedi race over, and when Boss gives them the heads up that the Jedi ship was inbound, Hondo tells Sing that he will neither help nor hinder her, before going out to greet these visitors. Plo is surprised to see the pirates selling out the hunters, but he knows that Aurra Sing's own hatred for the Jedi has caused her to go on this rampage. He doesn't want her recklessness to bring down his pirate kingdom as well. Once the Jedi come in, the hunters spring their trap, but Boba is disappointed.
I wanted Windu. What are you doing here?
They argue over how to get Windu to show up, but Plo is adamant that this will not happen.
I am prepared to kill you, the hostages, whatever it takes to get what Boba wants.
Sounds more like what you want.
And when Ahsoka springs the trap, Boba pleads with them to just give him Windu.
I'm not a murderer, but I want justice.
Though the two hunters would coordinate an attack that breaks them all up, Plo was able to use the Force to call the boy into his arms. Boba desperately calling out for help to the only person he knew to turn to.
Aurra, help! Help me!
Plo would ask the boy to do the right thing, but he is still stunned by this betrayal.
If you do not tell us where those men are, they are going to die. innocent men.
She left me.
Singh would race to the Slave One via speeder, with Ahsoka in hot pursuit, while Plo tries to invoke the aid of Hondo, the pirate calling on the legacy of the Mandalore.
Why should I help anybody? I've got no one.
It is the honorable thing to do. It's what your father would have wanted.
Ahsoka had tracked the hunter to Slave One, freeing the prisoners and climbing onto the vessel as Singh tried to scramble away. The Jedi would draw blaster fire to compromise the cockpit, and then damage the wing, sending Jango's prize ship into a fiery crash landing. Back on Coruscant, Boba would be put in handcuffs and brought before his father's killer. Despite the emotions, this now 11-year-old warrior opens with taking some responsibility.
I see now I've done terrible things. But you started when you murdered my father. I'll never forgive you.
Well, you're going to have to.
Callously simple, Windu does not try to lay into the boy's sense of guilt, he merely tells him, in a sense, to get over it. He and Bossk would be thrown into the same jail, and the bounty hunter that had risen to take his father's place as the best in the galaxy was there as well, Cad Bane. Kenobi was impersonating Rako Hardeen, and it is unclear if Boba knew this, but the real Rako Hardeen was a Mandalorian bounty hunter from his father's homeworld of Concord Dawn, and Cad Bane would have Boba fake a feud with Hardeen. This was all part of Bane's plan to create a prison riot to escape. The next time we see them, in the year 20 BBY, we see that Boba and Bossk were free men, and in Aurra Singh's absence, Boba was already highly respected and taken serious in the bounty hunting profession, which to Ventress was shocking to see.
Boss, this is your boss.
You got a problem with that? My name's Boba.
The fallen Sith thinks this is ridiculous, but Bossk and Latsrasi convince her that she will work in this boy's crew. And note the confidence Boba displays. Prison, and this time in the bounty hunting profession, was already hardening Fett.
What? You don't trust us? When the job's done, you'll get your cut, just like the rest of us.
Ventress had killed one of Fett's associates that was planned to be in this 6-person crew. And still not in possession of the Slave One, they traveled to the planet Korzite on Bosca's ship, the YV-666. This world had such great atmospheric pressure that all transport over the surface had to be restrained to tunnels, using a tram system. And these 6 hunters would be tasked with guarding a single chest containing some treasure, a motley crew that included the assassin droid Highsinger and Dengar, one who was also destined for bounty hunting fame. With their task explained to them, Boba makes sure that he starts to build that reputation for following his word.
You make the rules. I follow them.
They travel through the underground cave system with enormous glowing purple crystals and are set upon by the Kage warriors, ninja-like assassins who use their speed and strength to eliminate enemies. First, they would strike against Dengar and Ventress, some making their way into the train where they were blasted away by Boba, Highsinger, and Latsrasi. At only 12 years old, Boba Fett is blowing through these warriors with ease, using his father's Westar 34 blaster pistols and even some martial arts. Some of their tricks would work to send Bossk flying off the train, and their leader was able to outmaneuver Highsinger and Razi. Now only Boba remained. All the other Kage warriors were killed, but is shocked when their leader knocks over the chest to reveal its contents. Again, Boba finds himself in an unhonorable mission, and you can see that he truly wants to help the weak and innocent.
What? Don't worry, I'll protect you.
He is taken aback and slapped by the girl, before the brother leaps over and knocks Boba out cold. But the Kage were wrong to have counted Ventress out. She makes her way back to the train and is able to best their leader, straining both he and the young girl that was inside the box. But this captive strikes a nerve with Ventress, giving her a flashback of her childhood, and then she gets into an intense argument with Boba over how they will split the credits.
Boy.
Boy, you have no idea who you're talking to.
You have no idea who you are talking to.
Moments later, they would arrive at their destination. When Ventress hears that this sniveling creep was excited for the delivery of his bride, she was happy with the decision she made on the train. Getting her payment up front, she clears it before he opens the chest to reveal a hog-tied Boba Fett. The rest of the crew had made their way back to the orbital space station they arrived on, and Ventress gives the crew their pay, and says only that Boba will show up one day. From here, Fett would make his way back to Florum to reclaim and repair the Slave One, using the enormous scrapyard here, along with Hondo's connections, to get the iconic Fett ship up and running. A vessel that also contained his father's armor and various weapons. With these resources, he would complete a few smaller bounties, but felt lost in the galaxy, finding it difficult to grow his notoriety in this deadly profession. So he again returned to Jabba's palace, where he would come to befriend one of the cooks, Gab Boron, after rescuing his daughter Yagaba. Jabba gave him a mission in which he would compete against Dirge to kill a man named Gilramos Libkath, who was using orphans on Tatooine as an army of thieves, inserting a device into the orphans that would release a neurotoxin into the children if they disobeyed or left the planet. These children had surprised Boba and taken his helmet and weapons, leaving him only with a jetpack that was provided by the cook, Gab Bora. Dooku had hired Dirge to hunt down Boba, so though Dirge didn't want to go against Jabba's orders, he hoped to use the hunt for Gilramos to kill off Boba as well. And when they met at their target's base of operations, Boba was still weaponless, but his father trained him to never give up and apply your entire mind to finding a solution. And so he would use his jetpack to fly at the Neimoidian slaver, snatching his cap while drawing Dirge's fire, positioning himself so that the bolts would strike a fuel cell as he exited, causing the ship to erupt, consuming Dirge, and killing the target. Gilramos' cap working as proof of this hit. And to repay Fett for freeing his daughter, Jabba's cook, who had once been an experienced armorsmith, helped Boba to resize his father's iconic suit of armor. This would be followed by the quick and easy bounty on the Nagri assassin named Jordvar, who when given the chance to be taken alive or dead, chose death. And Jabba was thoroughly happy with this string of successes. Still in the blue and silver armor of the most notorious bounty hunter to ever live, Jabba's next assignment would be an incredibly dangerous and important mission: to kill the foreman of the Techno Union, Wat Tambor. This was in the year 19 BBY, the final year of the Clone Wars, and the death of this powerful CIS leader would prove a great victory to the Republic. But this was part of the problem as well. When Boba arrived in the Slave One, he saw the planet Zagoba was under full Republic invasion, forcing Fett to try and make his way past both CIS droids and GIR troops. While making his way through the fungal jungles, he runs into the changeling that had scammed him for his credits right after his father died, when he was trying to access Jango's accounts on that banking world. Nuri was now in the form of a snake and tried to strangle Boba, but he was able to throw him off and send him flying into a clump of neurotoxic fungus, finally getting his revenge after 3 years. But then Grievous showed up to the base where Wat Tambor was located. Grievous was once a Kaleesh warrior, another noble warrior people like the Mandalorians, and his cyborg-enhanced body and 4 lightsabers proved too much for the young Fett. In the duel, he decides that the only way to survive would be to fake his death by falling into the Zabar fungus. When he regained consciousness, he was able to make it back to the ship and give pursuit to Grievous and Wat as they fled into space. But Ventress, who was on a mission of her own, came in and started blasting at the Slave One. Despite his great piloting skills, this would be another defeat. The damage would have blown the Slave One to pieces if it had not been for the accidental savior Anakin Skywalker, who came flying in to eliminate Ventress, allowing Boba to limp away in Slave One. An incredibly disappointing loss in his father's ship and his father's iconic armor. The Slave One couldn't even make it through hyperspace, instead setting down on a nearby moon. Skywalker followed the smoking ship down to the surface to learn more about this rogue that was trying to kill these high-ranking CIS leaders. And this would be the first time these two have a conversation, with Anakin offering help with the extensive ship repairs. Here, the Slave One and Boba's armor would get a repaint. He couldn't stand the idea that he had not only failed in his father's image, but that perhaps he might have diminished his father's legacy. Someone might have thought that this was Jango Fett based on the iconic armor and ship coloring. By running around the galaxy looking like his dad, he was getting an unfair boost, too easy of a reputation, while maybe even insulting his father's legacy. To be his own man, this green, red, and yellow paint job would be the look that Boba would retain for the rest of his life, but one that also was a nod to Jango's old style, worn when he was just one of the lower-ranking soldiers in the true Mandalorian faction several decades earlier. Despite Skywalker giving aid, he still wanted to bring Fett in for questioning, and Boba thought he could use this to get close to his personal target, Jedi Master Mace Windu. He told the Jedi that he had information on how Lord Tyrannus was manipulating the Clone Wars, so Anakin told him where to rendezvous with Tarkin, who would escort Fett to the Jedi Temple. Once inside of the complex, he would find a way to sneak into Windu's personal quarters. Though his target was not home, he was able to learn that the Master was waiting for Palpatine in the office of the Supreme Chancellor. Here, Fett would ambush his target, turning the most important office in the galaxy into a battleground. After a long fight, neither were able to get the upper hand, and lay beaten and bloodied on the floor when the Chancellor came strolling in. Oddly not afraid of this sight, and telling the Jedi that this bounty hunter was here on orders to deliver crucial intel on the CIS. The Jedi Master was ordered to stand down and let Boba Fett be, while a similar order was given to Boba, allowing Windu to head back to the temple. He was furious at this missed opportunity, but knew this was the only ending to accept. Senate and royal guards ready to enforce these orders from the Chancellor. Boba, who was only 12 years old at this time, was pressed by Palpatine for the intel. But to Fett's surprise, the Chancellor says that he knew all along that Tyrannus was Count Dooku. He knew about his involvement in the clone army, and Palpatine even goes on to insinuate his own involvement in the army's creation, commending his father Jango Fett for being such an excellent warrior, and promises Boba enormous sums of credit if he were to forget about this whole story, telling the boy that they shared a common enemy in the Jedi Order, that his father had provided a great service to the Republic, and perhaps in the coming years, a new order would require the services of the son, Boba Fett. A short time later, Boba would hear about the Jedi's attempted coup, how his sworn enemy Mace Windu led the assault in the Senate, only to be slain in the process, denying Boba the vengeance that he had been seeking for 3 years. He would never be able to personally avenge the death of his father, a failure that would haunt Boba for the rest of his life. It is not certain if he would have known if this is a legitimate coup by the Jedi, or just the propaganda of the New Order that was calling itself the Galactic Empire, but everything seems to point to him being able to piece it together. His father did know that the clones' ultimate goal was to be used as tools to kill off all of the Jedi in the galaxy, and Boba's conversation with the Supreme Chancellor all but explicitly said that this man was a Sith like Tyrannus, with a burning rage similar to his to see the Jedi Order reduced to flames. And in this first year of the Imperial era, Boba was now 13 years old, which happened to mark the start of adulthood in the Mandalorian tradition. He was now a man in a new era. His first mission was given by the Imperial Grand Inquisitor Malorum, who wanted Fett to learn about any seditious movements spreading on planets Polis Massa, Balassa, and Naboo, who were all sympathetic to the late Senator Padme Amidala, the former queen who had become the face of peace and de-escalation during the Clone Wars. Already, just months after the declaration of the New Order, there were numerous rebel groups that needed to be put down. To help with this effort, the Inquisitor had Fett work with the bounty hunter Dahran, an Erodi species that had undergone a full cybernetic transition that essentially turned him into a mobile artillery weapon. The agile Fett would infiltrate the rebel strongholds, and then call in the big guns to blast away the more hardened opposition. Unbeknownst to him, this would eventually result in a skirmish with Obi-Wan Kenobi, who was desperately trying to flee back to Tatooine. Boba didn't know that the man piloting this ship was the same one that tricked his dad over Geonosis, but again Kenobi would survive a dogfight with the Slave One, this time going on offense and temporarily disabling Fett's iconic ship, buying him time to make the jump through hyperspace. Despite the fact that his target escaped, the Inquisitor was very impressed with the way rebel camps were extinguished, owed mostly to the young Fett's ability to gather intel and develop a plan of attack. He would get contracts like this for the next 2 years, putting us now in the year 16 BBY. And we see that Fett is starting to think of his other role in life, the mantle of carrying on the Mandalorian culture. He felt that with all the hunters he worked with, he was already the best around. To him, the title of greatest bounty hunter had been achieved, and he would attempt to try a lifestyle that he knew his father could have never envisioned, but one in which Jango did grow up in. Boba wanted to settle down and raise a family on his father's homeworld of Concord Dawn. He had fallen in love with another bounty hunter named Sintas Vel. At this time he was 16 years old and she was 18. They were madly in love. The two married and quickly had a child, a girl that they would name Aelin. Jango always wanted Boba to become Jaster's legacy, to honor the man that had saved Jango from the Death Watch raid. So Boba went as far as actually taking this man's name, using Jaster Muriel as an alias, as he entered into the Journeyman Protector Force on Concord Dawn, the position that was not only held by Jaster himself, but also by his biological grandfather. And this was the source of that symbol that would be worn by Boba Fett for the rest of his life. On this Mandalorian world, Fett and his wife felt that they could raise a child in this honorable culture, that prided itself on justice and honor above all else. But this dream was shattered, and Boba would be dealt the most devastating blow of his life. Though he thought nothing could be as terrible as that day in the Geonosian arena, much worse was his betrayal by his so-called Mandalorian brothers. A superior officer within the Journeyman Protectors raped his wife Sintas. When Fett found out who it was, the man was beaten to death. But just like the real Jaster Muriel decades earlier, who had killed a superior officer for his dishonor, Fett too was exiled, forced to never return to Concord Dawn. And the rage that filled Boba made him want to burn the whole planet down. An anger that compounded the tragedy for his wife, as she felt he was irreversibly changed by the incident. No longer a family man, but consumed by this singular lust for revenge. They would separate, and both agreed that Fett should never see his daughter again, and Boba would return to the life of a bounty hunter. At one point, Sintas was driven so mad by this abandonment that she worked with another bounty hunter to try and lure Fett into a trap, having pictures of them plastered up in hunter hangouts, knowing he would hunt down the source of these images containing Boba, his wife, and daughter. When Fett finally did track the source down, his wife tried to ambush him, but was subdued without being harmed. Fett understood her anger, but tells her that time will heal their wounds, that they have to move on. Though it should be noted that even 50 years later, we would see that Boba was still haunted by the series of events that destroyed his idyllic family life on that farm. The following 3 years would see him taking various contracts across the galaxy, from assassinations to intel gathering, and even meddling in speeder races. A relatively safe and lucrative gig if you could fix the games and guarantee a winner. Jobs that were most often given out by Jabba the Hutt. But in 12 BBY, it would be back to Imperial service. His work destroying rebel uprisings in those first months of the Empire would have Darth Vader calling on him to help put down the insurrection on Kamino. The Kaminoans were a people that had always managed to stay out of galactic affairs, never being under the yoke of any foreign government, until now. These past 7 years, the cloners had been secretly raising a new army to fight for their freedom, and when this was discovered, the 501st Legion would have a homecoming, returning to their watery homeworld to fight these clone abominations, all while being led by none other than Boba Fett.
Our mission commander, an expert on the inner workings of Kamino, was a young bounty hunter named Boba Fett.
Vader wanted Boba to lead the 501st in their assault on Tipoca City, since he was intimately familiar with the entire complex. And to make it even more personal, he was tasked with securing the DNA sample of his father, ensuring no Fett abominations were produced. No more tinkering with his bloodline by any scientists or politicians. With this mission a success, Vader was becoming more interested in the cloning process, while Boba returned to his benefactor Jabba on Tatooine.
The bounty hunter left after the battle was over. He said something about tracking down a smuggler on Tatooine.
And it was in this said mission that he would see another smuggler that would become the bane of his existence for years to come, first laying eyes on a Corellian named Han Solo, noting that he would watch his career with great interest. Over the next 7 years, the legend of Boba Fett grew, and along with it came a lot of confusion and mystery, all of which Boba encouraged. One of the most prevalent theories in the underworld was that Boba was actually Jaster Muriel, the leader of the true Mandalorians who had returned after all these years, the man who had saved and trained, and thus was superior to the feared Jango. Boba did nothing to squash these rumors, knowing that in a way this was one of the surest proofs that he was indeed carrying out his father's wish that he would become Jaster's legacy. Now in the year 5 BBY, he would accept a contract on that man Han Solo, who had done the incredibly foolish act of betraying the Basadi Hutt clans. Boba was able to capture him with the use of a neurotoxin that forced the victim to obey any commands, easily subduing Han and getting him in his restraints. But the scoundrel's friend Lando Calrissian was able to get the jump on Boba. Blaster thrusted up to the neck joint in his Mandalorian armor, while Lando stabbed Fett with the same toxin. He had no reason to kill Fett, so he just instructed him to keep on walking off indefinitely. Han would be rescued, and when the toxin wore off, Boba felt incredibly dishonored, swearing one day to get his revenge on this pair of smugglers. Throughout the year of 5 BBY, Han's incredibly good luck, if you believe in such a phenomena, was always saving his skin, Boba having a streak of bad coincidences that always saved Han at the last second. This allowed Solo to finish so many missions for Jabba that the slug came to love this new smuggler. His favorite hunter was Boba, and now his favorite spice runner was Han Solo. Fett was furious that he was unable to prevent Solo's rise, and now Jabba had given him direct orders to not lay a hand on his new favorite human, and he even paid Boba a good sum of credits to smooth things over between the two. Boba would honor Jabba's wishes, but was always keeping an eye out for a time when he could use some scenario to secretly orchestrate Han's accidental death. An ironic twist of fate, considering this was exactly how Dirge felt about the young Boba, when Fett was the one who received Jabba's blessing. To add insult to injury, Fett's next major assignment from Jabba would be a failure. He was tasked with capturing a rebel named Bria Theron, who was helping to coordinate the rise of the rebel movement on Teth. But because the contact wanted her brought in alive, and she never left the rebel stronghold, Fett found it impossible to infiltrate and extract her, making it one of the few missions in his lifetimes that he would have to abandon. But the next mission would come in 3 BBY. It had been 16 years since the death of Count Dooku, and the royal families on his homeworld of Sereno were in chaos. Counts and dukes were constantly betraying each other for scraps of power. The Empire wanted to drive this to a full-out civil war in order to have an excuse to invade, bringing peace and order at the cost of autonomy. Imperial intelligence agent Jahan Cross wore a suit of imitation Mandalorian armor when he assassinated Count Aden Dooku, and Fett was hired to kidnap the Duke of Sereno. This led to Boba fighting against Cross and the Duke's security forces, and although the Imp's martial arts were good, Boba managed to make some space and fire off a wrist rocket, incapacitating Cross and continuing to pursue the Duke to a hangar. He caught up with his target after a lengthy speeder bike chase, and was again attacked by the now recovered Agent Cross. Though he blinded Fett with a strike to the visor, Boba was able to again subdue the imp and fire off an ion missile from his jetpack. This should have just knocked out the electronics, preventing takeoff, but the vessel exploded, covering the entire hangar in flames and shrapnel. Cross knew Fett was supposed to take the Duke alive, and convinces the bounty hunter that they were both being played by Lord Borgin, who must have wanted to frame Fett as a political assassin. But in truth, this was all a part of the Imperial intelligence agent's plan to sow chaos on Sereno. It was he who placed the explosives on the Duke's ship, and having tricked Fett into accompanying him and going to the Borgin castle, they kill this lord and make it look like a couple of Mandalorians had murdered all 3 of the leading Sereno political figures. This way, no fingers were pointing at the Empire when they swooped in and took over the planet, which had the effect of only making the Empire like Fett even more. And the next contract would be personally issued by Darth Vader. The Sith explained that Imperial Colonel Abel Karda had disappeared after killing his superior officers and 4 bodyguards, before disappearing with a box that Vader claimed contained military intel. After a short negotiation on the price, where Fett could sense the Dark Lord attempting to use the Force to manipulate him, Fett agreed on 10,000 credits and set out in search of the AWOL imp. The trail would be a long one, and he would discover that this colonel had wiped out the Akari people and kidnapped their leader, a prophetess named Celestine. She was able to glimpse the future, and the imp thought he could use her as his own personal oracle, giving him an edge that would skyrocket his career within the Empire. When she tried to kill herself with poison, Karda took advantage of the Akari biology, cutting her head off, knowing this species could survive dismembered, and then stuffed that head into a box, carrying his portable fortune teller with him as he fled from planet to planet trying to evade Darth Vader's hunter. Eventually he came to the volcanic world of Marix Minor, and was taken in by an obscure religious group calling themselves the Ancient Order of Pessimists. But there was no losing the most notorious hunter in the galaxy. Fett stormed their compound and dodged blaster fire from Karda. Chasing him up into a tower, he pleads with them long enough to distract his target, bursting through and blasting him in the chest with a grapple hook at close range. The impact sends him flying out the window, where the hooks that implanted into his stomach kept him from falling into the lava. But with the press of a button, the gauntlet retracted the hook, ripping it out of Karda, dropping him down into the molten rock. As he turns to the chest, the Oracle speaks to him. It warns that Vader is coming to bring death, and Boba understands that Vader intended to kill him after completing this mission, out of fear that Boba would not be able to keep a secret of an Oracle that could predict the future, or that she might even make Fett turn against him. When the Dark Lord arrives, he says that he will give payment for the box, but Fett knows he offers only death. Boba refuses to have Celestine tell him his future, saying he will make his own future as he chucks an explosive at the approaching Sith. This blows away some of the walkway, but Vader sees that it was mostly a smoke bomb. Fett was trying to escape. Calling on the Force, he detects Fett's presence and destroys the speeder bike, before following up with a wrist rocket that sends Vader flying back. The EE-3 comes out and starts blasting away, only for these bolts to all be deflected. It looks like Fett had been trapped, and he fights to resist the mental infiltration by the Sith, taking the box and stepping back towards the lava. Vader is afraid to lose this Oracle. He races to the edge as Boba steps off the cliff, and as he leans over, he sees Fett with jetpack engaged, Boba aiming down the sights and sending a bolt that hits Vader square in the forehead, knocking the Dark Lord on his back and dropping his lightsaber. Fett hopes this will have proven that he won this battle, that Vader would yield, but he mocks this idea of honor, and calls on the Force to strip the EE-3 and bring Boba to his knees. Vader says he respects this hunter, so he will give him a swift death. But Fett says that they should remain allies. It was only this fortune teller that caused them to fight, and uses the last of his strength to kick the box over the edge, forcing Vader to choose Fett or Celestine, and the Dark Lord cannot let this Oracle burn away. Boba would race to the Slave One, while Vader consulted with his new prize. She warns him of the dangers of peering into one's future, and claims that there are still 2 realities available, one in which the Emperor executes him for becoming too much of a threat, and one where Vader surprises the Emperor, striking him down and taking rule. She also warns that in a moment, he will be hailed by Lord Sidious, and that Vader must kill her to prevent this power from falling into his hands. When Sidious does exactly this, Vader discreetly calls on the Force to cause her head to explode, green ooze flowing out of the box. Back in Slave One, Boba is thinking over this mission, and how at the end he had a chance to kill Vader. But remembering some of the wisdom Jango passed on in his book, there were no credits to be gained by making the entire Empire his enemy. He knew Vader would come to require his services again, and now would respect him as a warrior even more. And besides, he still had the Oracle's jewels that could fetch a great deal of credits. The following year, Boba would take a contract for Black Sun, to kill a lowly criminal named Bendu Fry. When captured, this man hoped to bargain for his life by giving up information on a Jedi that was alive on this same planet. If he could capture a Jedi, it would be one of the best paying bounties in the galaxy, while also satisfying his own bloodlust for killing off these sorcerers. But when he went to the location, he found that this was an illegitimate child of one of the Jedi Knights that was there during the Battle of Geonosis. Just like Boba, this child was made an orphan by the Petranaki arena, and Boba saw that there was no honor in killing this one that shared such a similar fate to his own. Instead, he went back and made sure to kill Bendu Fry. This same year, in 2 BBY, we see Boba's thoughts are on how even though Mace Windu was long gone, his anger towards the Jedi still remained. Minutes later, he arrived at a spaceport to meet with the Mune banker and bounty broker Gillian, who told him that he had something that should interest him, a contract for Connor Freeman. But the name doesn't ring a bell, and the insinuations he was making started to anger Boba. Blaster pointed up the Mune's nose. The banker says that this Connor Freeman had drained his account, an account that had been paying him out for years now, an account that was created for Freeman by Jango Fett. Boba demands to know what relation Connor has to his father, but the banker swears he doesn't know, only that he owed a lot of money to a crime lord named Tayand, an underworld figure Boba knows is insane and highly dangerous. At the same time, Connor was fighting for his life, having been woken up by a hunter trying to arrest him in the cantina, only to be set upon by a whole horde of hunters once he tried to go home. The firefight would last just long enough to allow Boba to make his way to the target, descending on jetpack and stripping Connor of his blaster, before a swift headbutt put him out. As Boba goes to place him in restraints, even more bounty hunters arrive and demand Fett turns him over. There is a brief argument about the bounty hunter code, and Bosk even intervenes, but nothing was going to stop this gang. They demand Boba drop the blaster, and tell him that he has no chance now that he's unarmed, which the Mandalorian-trained hunter thought was such an odd assumption. In a split second, the flames came rushing out of his gauntlet, scattering the forces, and then opened up with his blaster gauntlet, followed by a barrage of mini concussion missiles, and then wrapping them up with the whipcord. Connor would use the battle to try and slip away, but looked back only to see one of the most terrifying sights in the galaxy, Boba Fett rocketing down the alleyway towards him via jetpack. He snatches his target up and brings him above the alley, sending another missile down to take out anyone who might have been pursuing them, before delivering a spray that knocks Freeman unconscious. He would be brought onto Slave 1, where he says that Boba shares his father's face. That wasn't the response the hunter expected, but he understood how this connected to the mysterious account Jango opened. He thought this man must have been another one of Jango's kids. A difficult secret for Boba to swallow, but this claim enrages Connor, who storms to his feet, screaming at Fett that they are not brothers, that Jango was the man who murdered his father. Freeman thought all this time that it was his dad, the clone runaway, that had left him this inheritance. But Boba points out how ridiculous that was. That amount of credits was not earned by some runaway taking odd jobs. When Connor calls Jango scum, he gets a swift backhand, though even this did not deter him. A lifetime being tortured by the events of that night remove any fear, and he continues to insult Boba and Jango, calling Fett not a son, but a product. And Boba simply lays into the claims, saying he felt nothing when he shot Connor's father 20 years ago. Freeman snaps and lunges for Fett's neck, the two tumbling down the Slave 1 boarding ramp. While out of the clouds emerged a vessel that opened fire. The blast consumed much of the platform and destroys the nearby buildings. Craft then lands, takes Connor, and the hunter turns a blaster on Boba, telling him this was payback for all his dead hunter friends. Similar to the day Jango killed Connor's father, Boba saw that although this was a fellow hunter, this man was not as ruthless as he was, and mocks him for not being able to shoot him in the face. The hunter is rattled, covering up Boba's face as he fires right into Fett's chest, before hopping back into his ship to take off. In transit, the hunter would contact a sadist that was hoping to buy Connor and torture him, the crime lord Taylan. But much like Boba, Connor too mocks the man, ridiculing him for not checking to make sure that Fett was dead, most likely because he was too scared to get close to the body, and if he didn't in fact kill him, all he did was make Boba angry. The Mandalorian armor and undersuit were able to disperse the blaster pistol shot, and Fett returned to Slave 1, where we see him thinking to himself about his purpose in life, a life that revolved around his father's death, spending every moment working towards the goals Jango had placed on Boba before he was even born. And his thoughts again culminate in the question that he's often asked himself over the years: how do you make a dead man proud? The crime lord Tayand was eagerly awaiting his prize, but Connor was a sneaky son of a clone, stealing a blaster and killing one of the hunters, and turning on the leader before being snatched up by Boba. They soar away to Tayan's compound, and Connor begs Boba to listen to why he had this bounty placed on him in the first place. It wasn't that he gambled away his inheritance, it was that he made himself so good at sabacc that he was able to multiply his father's, or in fact Jango's, inheritance. He wasn't a degenerate, he had been winning all the games. It's just that the crime lord could not accept defeat. Connor explains that he thought the best thing he could do was to increase his father's legacy, and makes an eerily similar statement to Boba, that he was just trying to make a dead man proud. Boba was shocked at how alike they were, but forces himself to carry on with the bounty. Going into the sadist throne room, Tayan was about to pay Fett when the original hunter burst into the room, claiming his bounty was stolen, but all dismiss him. Fett had the bounty now, and his reputation was a notorious one, which is precisely why everyone was shocked when Fett asked how much Connor owed, and says that he would pay off the outrageous 500,000 credit debt. Everyone, including Freeman, is stunned by what they just heard. The name Boba Fett had never been associated with philanthropy, but Tayan dismisses the offer, saying he wants to torture Connor for beating him, and when Fett pushes, Connor takes the initiative, understanding that this scary hunter in green armor was at his core driven by honor, that Boba honored his own father's legacy by fulfilling these contracts. And since Tayan had already given Boba his pay, this hunter was free to take another bounty. So Connor puts out a measly 3-credit hit on Tayan, which Boba accepts. The disbelief led to a split second of peace before the room erupts in chaos. And when the madman sees this was real, he screams at Fett that he would not want to have him as his enemy, to which Fett coldly replies, "No, you're a dangerous madman. I have no interest in having you as an enemy," and puts a blaster bolt through his head without a second thought. In a flash, he was on one of the guards, using him as cover as he blasted the rest. While Connor also picks off some and runs to join Boba, who is now peppering a Rancor with bolts just to make it even more angry. More henchmen rush in, and through a wrist rocket, the Rancor's chains are broken. This duo makes it into one of the halls, and Fett gives Freeman a blaster, explaining that they will have to fight the beast, but Connor sees the League hunters zeroing in on Boba, pushing him out of the way and in the process taking a bolt to the shoulder. The move allows Fett to close the distance and blast the hunter in the chest. And now the hunter asks Boba if he can shoot a defenseless man in the face. Boba assures him he can, but he has a better idea, and straps the last member of the League of Bounty Hunters into a jetpack, waiting for the Rancor to spot them. When it roars, Fett activates the pack and sends the hunter flying into the beast's mouth, missile and rocket boosters exploding, killing the Rancor. Before they leave, Fett gets his payment, and Connor rushes off to pillage the crime lord's treasures, while Boba gets to work removing a tooth, thinking back to that day with the Bayleg, when his father showed him how to be fearless. Now just 1 year before the Battle of Yavin, Boba would see the opportunity to realign himself with Lord Vader. While in a cantina on the planet Darguli, he saw as all the hunters rushed to their feet and checked out reports that Vader was being ambushed in the city. Dozens of hunters were trying to do the impossible and bring down the Sith, the Emperor's fist that had been smashing up criminals in every star system. Boba rushes into the firefight, and as soon as he saw the hunters didn't have a chance, he turns on them and starts blasting away, killing several hunters as he made his way closer to Vader, showing the Sith that they needed to trust each other again. Once all the hunters had been dealt with, a woman appears wielding a lightsaber, declaring that she is no Jedi, but that she wants to be trained as a Sith, that together they could overthrow the Emperor and rule the galaxy. Without saying a word, Vader approaches and cuts her down, prompting Boba to remind the Dark Lord that he had just helped save his life, that one of those hunters had a clear shot on him, and Vader admits that he will consider an alliance with Boba. A few weeks later, this maneuver would prove lucrative, as Vader contracted Boba to eliminate a pirate stronghold over the planet Ilum. These pirates were working with rebel forces, and this led him to the target that got away, Bria Theron. He was able to drug and incapacitate her, and even capture Lando along the way. To her surprise, Boba promises that, per her request, he will tell her father that she was killed once Boba turns her in, instead of just leaving her father to wonder what happened to her. But just as he was about to depart, their ship was swarmed by the pirate forces of an ex-girlfriend of Lando's. She brought too many forces for Fett to evade, and Boba tried to just let Lando go and keep Bria, but he refused, eventually getting his ex-girlfriend to pay Boba 100,000 credits in order to release them both. Another hit to his ratio of captures, but at least he got his credits. Just 6 months before the Battle of Yavin, we see that Fett was living in an apartment in a rundown district on Nar Shaddaa. Here he lived with his lover and fellow bounty hunter, Zasha. An evening that was to be filled with passion and Korriban wine was cut short by a call from Darth Vader, who tells Fett that this job will pay triple, but that he needs to head to Cato Neimoidia immediately. Boba and Zasha get their arms and armor and head out for the Slave One, where Boba explains that their target is a powerful Force wielder named Starkiller. And the first sight they get of the Neimoidian hanging cities has her worried. And once they get inside, they see scores of dead stormtroopers, and Zasha wants to grab some loot, knowing these helmets will sell great on the black market. But Boba uses his whipcord to wrap her up and says to stay focused on the mission. As they make their way through the rubble, they come upon an enormous creature in the arena. The Gorog appears dead, but as they approach, it springs to life. By using the viewfinder, Boba is able to see vital organs, and can tell that its secondary heart was still pumping. With a well-placed rocket, he blows a hole through the beast before sending himself flying through the wound, blasting along the way. The creature was completely dead this time, but when he turns to Zasha, he already knows what she was thinking. If this was just the start of the job, she didn't want to stick around to see just how bad it would get. Pleading with him to come with her, she knows that he was bound by honor to see it through, and comments on how great they were both in and out of armor, and as she walks away, she looks back to blow him a kiss. Boba getting one last look at his lover through a viewfinder. Vader would then call him to Kamino, where he would show the hunter the devastation Starkiller brought about during his escape. And when the Dark Lord explains that he is not to go after Starkiller himself, but rather capture his love interest, Juno Eclipse, who is within a rebel fleet, Boba knows he'll need backup.
Lead a squadron of stormtroopers. They won't be coming back.
And he is supplied with the horrifying terror soldiers.
They'll do.
After this, Boba heads to talk with one of the Imperial cloners. The Kaminoans have been stripped of all cloning privileges since the uprising more than a decade earlier. The human scientist explains that these clones have been bred using a new method that can bring the clone from infant to infantry in only a few weeks. A radical and dangerous acceleration method that was resulting in issues with their brain development and guaranteed insanity within a year, often much sooner. This disturbs the man that was himself a clone, raised on a platform just like this, but he must ignore it for now and focus on the mission. In Slave One, we see Fett had captured a mechanic and given him some sort of truth serum. To help make some credits on the side, this mechanic would alter the registries and transponder codes of ships, often for those within the Rebel Alliance, and Fett knew he had worked on Juno's ship. He now gave up that the ship was called the Salvation, and that there was more info on his datapad. With this, Boba is able to track down the Rebel fleet's movements to an obscure sector of the Outer Rim. He uses the asteroid field to conceal himself and the TIE bomber variants, explaining the plan of attack to the bomber pilots and pointing out Starkiller's personal ship. He intercepts the transmission from General Ram Koda, noting the Y-Wing escort and prepping his forces for an all-out attack, saying to deliver the terror soldiers to the bridge and to kill anything in their way, except for Juno Eclipse. On this command, the forces fly out from behind the asteroids, ion bombs smashing into the Nebulon B, disabling the reactor before firing their pair of boarding pods. The rebel troops are shaking in their boots as they watch lasers cut through the ship, delivering the monstrous cyborg troopers. When he gets reports of their success, Boba uses Slave One to take out the hangar controls and then jumps out of his ship to make the approach via jetpack, easily blasting his way through the hangar and then the corridors to meet up with the terror squads. On the bridge, Juno and her officers are desperately trying to get the ship operational, but it was too late. The Imperial forces blow their way in, and Boba is quick to dodge the incoming fire, and is able to wound Juno, shooting her in the shoulder and telling her that if she wants the rest of the crew to be left alive, she will come with him. Shock restraints are placed on her, as well as an oxygen supply, before he explains that they will do a short spacewalk back to Slave One. Target in hand, he fires the whipcord at his ship, and they zip over while Starkiller rushes out just in time to see his lover brought aboard. During transit over to Kamino, Juno tries to scare Fett into letting her go, and he calmly says that they will see what happens, but that she does not even know this man pursuing them, that this was not Starkiller, but a clone of the one she loved, that her true love was long dead. She now pleads with him to understand what it's like to have this happen to someone you love, that surely even this bounty hunter had experienced true love. And though Boba dismisses this and walks away, we see that alone in the cockpit he is troubled by his own memories of his family. Fett tells Vader that he wants his pay immediately, that he doesn't want to stick around and see the powerful and insane clone Jedi abomination, but Vader insists that he will stay. Boba will help ensure that Vader's apprentice is captured, and when this mission is successful, he will have an exclusive contract with the Empire. Boba pushes this further, demanding that he gets right of first refusal, and he negotiates the rate for each and every job independently, and that the Empire will cover all the expenses he deems necessary for these jobs, locking in Boba's status as the top hunter in the galaxy. He releases Juno, and when she warns that he is foolish to trust the Empire, he simply states that they will always need a bounty hunter. And either way, he knew where to hide if things went south. Only a few moments later, the invasion of Kamino would begin. The rebels throwing an enormous fleet at the effort of capturing both Juno and ensuring the destruction of the Empire's cloning facilities. Vader explains how well defended this world was, but knows that his apprentice will find a way past them. And on cue, the fragments of a Nebulon B come flying towards the city. Boba would soar to intercept, weaving past the debris and starfighters only for it to prove too much, overwhelming Fett and forcing him back to the platforms, where he is then fired on by Rom Koda and rebel troops. Rushing into one of the buildings, he is set upon by a failed clone of Galen Marek, a disfigured but still incredibly skilled fighter, that severs Boba's blaster, forcing him to unleash the flamethrower and leap back. This was not enough. Burned but not defeated, the monster rushes Boba, forcing him to send a jetpack missile straight into the clone's head. He would run further into the complex, coming upon the scientist he met earlier. Boba explains that they need to evacuate, but the cloner just says that these specimens can be left behind and examined later. This enrages Boba, and raises his blaster to the cloner's head, and swears that he will not allow clones of his father to be treated like this. But the scientist corrects him, saying these were not Jango clones, but those of Boba. That Vader had hired a bounty hunter to get skin cells and even a brain scan of him while he slept. These clones are raised with the flash memory technique that would make them all think that they were Boba Fett. As soon as he hears this, he pulls the trigger. Remember back to the time when Boba was just a boy, and outraged at any insinuation that he was just like one of those thousands of other clones, screaming at them that they were not his brothers. And knowing these clones would all suffer from insanity and suffer a horrible death upon a short, painful life, he flies around the facility, setting the entire thing ablaze, boiling the clones to death and ending this twisted project. By the time he gets back outside, he sees Vader confronting Starkiller, and before he can take the shot, Boba is attacked by Rom Koda and his men. Despite the numbers, the Mandalorian trained warrior eliminates all of the troops in a few seconds, and beats the general down to the floor. The rebel calls out to Proxy, the combat training droid that contained a full realism hologram that allowed him to mimic anything in his database. Seeing this was Boba Fett, he thought he had just the image that would give him a psychological edge. Boba is shocked to see his father flicker into existence. Boba would be forced to try and kill this mirage of his beloved dad. Brutal combat that utilized punches, headbutts, and blaster bolts, eventually bringing Boba down. The general tried to get Fett to concede, but there was always a trick up the bounty hunter's sleeve, rolling out a sonic grenade, a type of weapon that wouldn't get past his Mandalorian helmet, but which would devastate the rebels and droid. Calling on his jetpack, he secures the high ground and set up the sniper to take the shot. But as he zeroes in, he hears the conversation between Starkiller and the downed Vader. The man expressing the depths of his pain at all he had lost, and the madness that came with trying to determine what it meant to be an individual if you might just be a clone. Boba thinks the only move for Starkiller is to end Vader, and despite his opportunity at a secure contract, he wanted to see how this one played out. This whole mission was literally too close to home for Boba. He lets Starkiller make the decision to allow Vader to live, and then tracks him as he runs over to the wounded Juno. On the edge of death, they share a kiss, and Boba Fett, the most notorious killer in the galaxy, cannot pull the trigger. He had once tried to love, and in what felt like another life, he knew how maddening it was to consider yourself just a clone. He would let Starkiller have this moment, and would pack up and head to Slave One, still intent on eventually finishing this contract. He knew Vader well enough to know that he would escape whatever pathetic rebel prison he was sent to, and when he was free, Fett wanted to be able to say that he had killed Starkiller, though whatever became of this bounty is still unknown. Only a few weeks after seeing this gut-wrenching experience, he would be set on a trajectory to run into his ex-wife and rejoin Connor Freeman, a string of events that all started with what appeared to be Boba's death. Governor Purton of Concord Dawn had hired a bunch of killers to lead Boba into a trap and kill him. The governor wanted live, video proof of this hit, and used the holo recorders to broadcast it all over the galaxy, celebrating the death of this notorious Mandalorian. Connor would see this in his bar, which he now owned after stealing all those credits from Tayand. He points out to his bartender that the holo looks suspicious, that a Zabrak army captain and storm commandos working together to take out Fett didn't make sense. He goes to make a toast to Boba, and when nobody seems to care, he offers a free round on the house, eliciting unanimous cheers for Boba Fett, before storming out to think about what he could do next. We jump 3 weeks later and see a robed figure on the Zabrak world of Iridonia, a figure who is blocking the way for Captain Cybar. When the troops approach, they get blasted in an instant, and the captain's weapon is destroyed. This figure raises a blaster to the Zabrak's head and demands to know who ordered the hit on Fett. Cybar tries to act fearless and insult the legacy of Boba, but when he says the world where the hit was carried out, this mysterious figure kicks the captain off the skybridge. On Concord Dawn, we see Governor Purton being briefed of these deaths by his spy master Taisheen. He is adamant that Fett's death cannot be linked back to him, and she promises to hunt down the leads on the robed man. When he arrives on Sathamon, we see this figure identified as Connor Freeman. He would ambush a stormtrooper on Dewback Patrol and gets him to give up the name of the storm commando in charge, Maka Webs. News of this also makes its way to Purton, who is blasting mouse droids at this point to try and relieve his stress, telling his spy master that he wants anyone who cares for, who has ever helped Fett, to be killed. All traces of Boba need to be wiped from history, and Taisheen mentions the child that she had found. Purton reiterated that yes, all of them must die. Connor would be back in the cantina when a holo went out saying that he was wanted for the murder of a stormtrooper. Just then, a stormtrooper rips Connor over the counter and drags him out into the streets, only to have the sun blocked out by an enormous craft, which opens up with a laser weapon that creates an enormous explosion and left a crater in the middle of the city. When Freeman comes to, he is looking out through a Bacta tank on the ugly side of Dr. Evazan. The trooper is there as well, and he helps Connor through the shock of seeing that he had lost an arm in the explosion. Connor wants to know who this trooper is and why he saved him, but is urged to keep quiet. Once away from the dock, the helmet is removed to show Boba Fett was very much alive. Connor piecing it together right away that Fett must have somehow stolen his identitabs in order for Fett to make it through the ever-increasing Imperial lockdowns. Freeman isn't even upset, he just wants to know how Fett survived, and Boba goes on to explain how this all escalated from a hunt for a man named Bendak. The man was hiding in a hole in the middle of the desert, and when Fett was explaining how he found him, he got blasted in the back, falling into this hole himself, but he was able to take out Bendak and went to work dressing the target in his own armor, suspecting that he had been tracked here, installing with the death squad that was assembled above. Once they are about to open fire with the flamethrower, Boba fires into the jetpack to make it activate and sends his decoy soaring above the killers. They Swiss cheese him, which destroys the jetpack as well, causing him to drop out of the sky, removing his helmet to let the galaxy finally see the face of the most notorious bounty hunter in the galaxy, a move that had tricked everyone. But the problem now was that Connor had to play dead too, as long as there was someone going around trying to kill anyone connected to Fett. Boba goes on to explain that they would have to go to a place that dead men can walk around safely without attracting attention, to Mandalorian space. Moments later, they would descend into Jango's homeworld of Concord Dawn. The transport set down on a farm, and Fett tells Connor to look after a hunter named Sintis Vel, without explaining to him that this was his ex-wife. He just goes on to explain that he will try to infiltrate an Imperial training moon called Blackfell, but this might take him an entire year, and he must tell no one that Boba Fett is alive, especially not Vel. Over Blackfell, Boba gets past the security by blasting away at the ship's engines and claiming to have just escaped a rebel ambush. He sets the craft for a crash course with the control tower and throws in a thermal detonator for good measure, before coasting down to safety via jetpack. In Concord Dawn, we see that Connor was able to trade credits for information at a local bar, and found the Vel homestead. He wouldn't know it, but the little girl that answered the door was Boba Fett's daughter, though right now she was claiming to be Vel. When Connor is doubtful that she catches dangerous criminals, she says, quote, "I just caught you, didn't I?" And a blaster presses up against his skull. Vel is aiming down the sights. And while Connor is trying to explain, a blast flies in and nearly takes their heads off. They whip around to see an attack craft full of Deveronian mercenaries. Now Vel is sure that Connor was trying to kill her, but he claims this isn't what it looks like. When he urges her to go protect her daughter, she is confused by the word protect, and a massive bolt of electricity fires out from the window, disabling the Merc speeder, Vel explaining that her daughter did not need protection, and the pair rush out to blast away the stunned Deveronians. Meanwhile, on the Imperial moon, Fett's plan was working. The explosion made it look like it killed anyone on board, and created a commotion that attracted all nearby resources. But as the Force would have it, Lord Vader was on site, and called to Stormtrooper Fett to explain what happened. If the Sith had called on the Force to peer into his mind, who knows how this mission would have ended. But luckily, Vader didn't think twice about the rank-and-file stormtroopers, and with the explanation, he sends Fett on his way. He finds his mark coaching stormtroopers in some sort of fight club. Captain Awev sees through Fett's claim that Vader has summoned him, and calls out Boba for wearing the armor of a trooper he knew personally. The captain orders his men into formation, but Boba is not impressed. He quickly fires on the armory right behind the bucketheads, which sends the bodies flying, and makes sure to lay down next to his target. showing that he was hoping to use the transport to the medbay to kidnap the captain. Though a full lockdown forces him to speed up these plans, using the trusty jetpack to get over to a Lambda, taking off from the base while it's still in chaos, knowing that the other ships will let him pass, that they won't be expecting any clearance codes to be sent from the destroyed control tower. On Concord Dawn, Connor is with Fett's daughter Aylin while her mom is checking on the defenses. The girl says that her father was dead, and they go on to tell bedtime stories. When Vel gets back, she wakes Connor up and thanks him for the help. Looking into his eyes, she says that he reminds her of someone. She springs a kiss on him. Some time would pass, and while she was sleeping, he frees his arm and goes to the kitchen to get some food. Curiosity gets the best of him, and he activates an old holo projector. His stomach dropping as he sees this woman he had just embraced was the mother of Boba Fett's child. Meanwhile, Fett was in Slave One with the captain. Behind him we see that all these years, Boba had been adding to his collection of monster teeth, and threatens to use the venom still on the Bayleg tooth to torture his captive. This imp wasn't about to suffer because of others' machinations, so he gives up the name of Governor Purton and his spy master. At the same time, we see that Purton was staring at a holo of his dead son, a son who would have been 30 if not killed by Fett. Purton's son was the man who raped Sintus Vel, destroying all hopes for a normal Fett family life. But the governor didn't know this, and he is driven so blindly enraged that he wants to execute Fett's family personally. The spymaster had tracked them from the farm to the safe house in the city and placed a breach on their door. Governor Purton there with tanks and a squad of journeyman protectors to carry out the arrest. The organization Boba's biological grandfather and adoptive grandfather were a part of, whose emblem was still on his armor, were now trying to kill his daughter and ex-wife. Grenades were thrown into the rooms, and with the fire spewing out into the streets, Purton assumes that they are all dead. But the wise spymaster says to let it burn longer. Do not underestimate the once wife of Fett. But a split second later, a protector looks up to see Slave One bearing down on them, laser cannons tearing up the entire street, killing some journeymen and narrowly missing the governor. Outraged by all this, the governor takes men with him and goes to storm into the safe house, while Boba Fett moves into position, EE-3 blaster rifle picking off protectors, allowing the spy master to sneak up on him. She thought she had him, but Boba calmly explains that he understands that she was the one who studied him, that this was her whole plan, and that she also knows there was no way for her to win. He convinces Taisheen to put the blaster down, and tells her that she works for him now. Her job will be to make sure that no one else can discover the only two people Fett cared about. When she agrees, he descends to the street, and walks up to protect his family. The governor and his men had just fallen into the secret room, which doubled as the armory, and are rudely surprised by Vel and Friedman in their Mandalorian suits of armor. His protectors get blasted, and the governor knows he was defeated, but he defiantly explains why he feels justified, saying he was only getting revenge. Vel can see that this father did not know why his son was killed, but even when she explains what he did to her, the governor doesn't accept it. Instead of trying to understand, he turns to violence and grabs her by the neck, and for that, he gets shot right in the chest by Connor. He had saved her twice now, and she leans over to kiss him again, just as Boba Fett had walked in. This wasn't the reunion he hoped for, but they didn't see him, so he simply turns around and leaves. Vel tells Connor that he has to go, despite his protests, saying that she can't be reminded of Boba Fett again, and to tell him that when Connor sees him. Emerging from the safe house, Connor at this point isn't even surprised to see Boba Fett there. He simply states that everyone was safe, while Boba says, quote, "You kissed my wife," though they agree that she was not his wife anymore. And Connor reveals a gift, a human tooth to add to all those other monsters. And Fett asks about his daughter as they walk off through the streets of Concord Dawn. After this physically and psychologically difficult mission, Fett would return to the only thing close to home in the galaxy, Jabba's palace, and he would be in the spaceport of Mos Eisley when his rival Han Solo was trying to talk his way into the graces of Jabba, who had temporarily lifted the restrictions on getting Han Solo, only to be talked into allowing his favorite human another chance, though the events of the next couple of days would put Han Solo officially on Jabba's bad side. Alderaan would be destroyed, and rebel forces claimed to have taken out a moon-sized space station with just a few squadrons of starfighters. To counter this rise of rebellion, the Empire became an even more lucrative business partner. And though they often chose to work exclusively with members of the bounty hunter guilds, they made an exception for Boba Fett. The guild members were more reliable than most hunters, and for Imperials worried about working with freelance murderers, the guild worked as a way to hold hunters accountable. Anyone that betrayed a patron would be killed by the other guild members. They also had a long list of rules that held the organization together, and for all these reasons, Boba found them despicable. Once quoted as saying, "I'm not restricted by the authority of your so-called bounty hunters guild. I answer to a higher law," referencing his oath to his father and the Mandalorian Code of Honor. Now, a being called Kudar Mab'ath was a member of one of the strangest species in the entire galaxy, a sort of organic computing system in the form of a spider and large web that floated out in space. It formed a bounty to find a candidate worthy of tearing the whole thing down, and Boba was the hunter that came through. Luckily for the spider, Fett was more than happy to destroy the codependent Hunters Club, but the job would force him to join the guild first, being under Bosk's father, Kradosk. The old Trandoshan was happy to see Fett's apparent change of heart, and welcomed him into the fold, though the younger generation all found this suspicious. In the first mission, Fett would work with his longtime associate Daharhan, the artillery-firing cyborg that helped to crush the first of the rebel dissenters in that first year of the Empire. They were assisted by Zuckuss and Bosk, but a clan of shell huts killed their target and went on a bloody rampage that dragged all these hunters into the melee. When the dust cleared, Daharhan was killed, and Zuckuss reported that Bosk had fallen as well. Fett worried about how the lizard's father would take the news, but the cold-blooded leader was happy to hear that so many of the hunters had been slain, that their guild was long overdue for some shakeup. Bosk overheard this and snapped into a rage of his own, ripping his father apart with his bare hands. The hunters all turned on each other, mostly split into older versus younger. This civil war was the first part of the Spider's plan against the guild. Fett would then team up with Bosk to hunt down a renegade Imperial trooper. But during this mission, Bosk came to realize that Boba had manufactured this split in the guild, pushing him to kill his father, so he furiously turned on Fett. Zuckuss was able to intervene, but Boba thought he saw an opportunity to take them both out, and confirmed his treachery by trying to get both of these hunters killed, themselves considered two of the most deadly hunters in the galaxy behind Fett. Running for their lives and barely escaping Slave One, Boba took the stormtrooper deserter to Mab'ath's web, that was just floating out in a remote part of wild space. And when he saw that he was still being chased by the man's renegade Imperial allies, their ability to track him was the final detail that proved to Fett that this spider broker was actually trying to set him up as well. A clever plan to use the top hunter to take out the bounty hunter guild, and then in the process kill off that top hunter. So he set Slave One for a crash course with this web, nearly killing the spider and scattering his Imperial tail. Boba hopped out and demanded payment for his destruction of the guild, but the spider assured him that he was not the one that placed the bounty, he was just the broker. The real person behind this was the Black Sun crime lord Prince Xizor. Boba forced him to contact Xizor and bring him out to this odd web computer structure to discuss his credits. The criminal prince agrees, but when the credits actually came to his account, Fett found out that the other half of this bounty was taken by another spider of this strange species that claimed that he was owed half for the cost of the intel provided. Xizor also paid for the bounty of Vos Aunt the Stormtrooper, but this experience with the assembler spider species left Fett vowing that he would get revenge. But at least that pathetic bounty hunter guild was reduced to ashes. After this, Fett would inadvertently foil an Imperial project that both Vader and Emperor Palpatine took personal interest in. Project Starscream was one of the most secretive projects of the time, which sought to make super soldiers that could defy death. Dr. Evazan was one of the lead researchers, being the galaxy's expert in reanimating flesh. The bounty on Evazan had nothing to do with this project, but Boba caught up with him on the death planet known as the Necropolis. Here Fett would find that the dead were rising, having to fight off armies of reanimated corpses to make his way to the main lab and eliminate the Doctor. Though, as you might expect, the man who had raised others from the dead with his revolutionary serum had pumped himself full of it as well, and Fett had to kill him again. This planet still had a large population of normal living folk, and their leader insisted that these hordes of zombies were the result of an ancient curse, not some new science, demanding that Fett leave Evazan's body there to be ritually buried in order to appease the spirits. Boba doesn't like it, but sympathizes with the horrors these people have been through, saying that if he doesn't get paid, he will be back for the body. But luckily he was able to confirm the kill and get paid, while still leaving the Necropolitans with their symbolic comforts. This mission was followed by a contract that has an ending that is either incredibly cruel or sympathetic, depending on how you look at it. Imperial officer Aaron Harcourt, a man who looks like he could have been a body double for Tarkin, had lost everything he loved. His ship went down years earlier, and Boba was tasked with infiltrating it, blasting through all the Minox and security droids still in place, and retrieving a holo recording. Once he returned it to the Imperial officer, the Imp explains that he had been the scapegoat for the ship's loss, and then he lost his wife. He didn't have the credits necessary to pay Fett, he just wanted to see her message one last time. Knowing that he could not permit this lack of payment, and perhaps sensing that Harcourt did not want to live, Fett blasts the officer after letting him enjoy his cherished recording. From here, it would be back to one of his best patrons, Darth Vader. He was hunting down a pair of Force-sensitive children and a traitorous geneticist, telling Fett that the trail led to the planet Dagobah. Shortly upon arrival, he would be ambushed by an enormous snake dragon which knocked him unconscious. Luckily, he fell into a pit which prevented him from being devoured. Here he was discovered by a small band of beings that were the descendant of a Republic survey team, that team being stranded on this remote world decades earlier. They had all become cannibals, and stripped Fett of all of his gear before throwing him into a cage to be held before preparing him for dinner. Here, Fett would identify those Force-sensitive children he had been tracking, and convinces one of them to let him go. Once free, Fett would fight to reclaim his gear while the cannibals scattered. And while he was chasing them down, he actually ran into the Force cave that Yoda would later take Luke to. He even saw Yoda, but dismissed the old big-eared frog hermit. It's unclear what, if any, visions Fett received in the cave. Perhaps it only interacted with those that were Force-sensitive. He was about to capture his targets, but Vader contacted him with an immediate order to return to him to discuss a new bounty. He received information on the location of the scoundrel-turned-rebel Han Solo, and one of Vader's personal spies had also defected to the Alliance. Fett would be compensated for the work so far, and Solo would help that spy make a narrow escape from the Hunter's search, which took him to the man's hideout on the ice world of Oda. This loss was followed by a contract from another cybernetically enhanced human of the Empire, General Rom Mak, creator of the Dark Trooper project that turned old clones into cyborg killing machines, needed Fett to stop the notorious Rebel Alliance special agent Kyle Katarn. This man was one of the most skilled agents in the entire rebellion, and when Fett ambushed him on Coruscant, Katarn actually knocked him unconscious. His Mandalorian suit of armor absorbs the damage, but provides Katarn with enough of a window to escape, which allowed him to go on to destroy the Dark Trooper project, and would remain as one of Boba's most devastating failures. Luckily, the secrecy of this project itself helped prevent the spread of this news. From here, it was a job of his own initiative. Fett came across a derelict ship that was worth exploring. To help him, he goes down into the holding cages in Slave 1 and picks Sumo, whose bounty would pay the same whether he came back alive or dead. Once they get into the main hangar, Fett spots a casket made of a precious metal, and when he opens it, he sees that it was for royalty, a plaque reading, Volpau, third cousin of Emperor Palpatine. The body was on its way to Coruscant, but something burrowed its way out of the corpse and through the metal coffin. When they make it to the bridge, they see dead bodies covered in boils, and odd wings that are all strewn about. Sumo spots a blaster, and tries to use the distraction to take a shot at Fett, but this was a stupid move. He got blasted in the blink of an eye, and fell into the corpses, exciting the flesh borers to explode out and swarm them both. They can't get to his flesh, but the corrosive liquid they secrete can burn through anything, even Mandalorian armor. He has Slave 1 disengage from the ship, and has to turn his flamethrower on himself to burn them all off, hoping the armor and undersuit weren't compromised. To escape, he would launch himself away in a trash chute, and use his remote command of Slave 1 to retrieve him from space. Once inside the ship, we see that always with an eye towards profit. Throughout all that chaos, Boba had managed to retain the jewel-encrusted crown of the Emperor's cousin. Next, it was back to work with the Empire, being tasked to hunt down a holocron that was created by Bail Organa, which was hidden in the asteroid field created by the destruction of Alderaan, the grim testament to the Death Star known simply as the Graveyard. When Fett emerged from hyperspace, he saw a full-scale battle between Alliance and Imperial forces. He picked up on the location of the holocron, but the powerful Renegade Squadron was being personally led by Han Solo, and they were able to chase away Slave 1 and do serious damage that forced Fett to flee through hyperspace. This enraged Boba so much that he wanted to use his next bounty to make a show of force, to add a little extra infamy to his name. A slicer named Rivo was hoping that his high-ranking Imperial brother could hide him from the bounty hunters after his head. But Bad Mood Boba was truly a terrifying force. Unconcerned with how this might annoy his Imperial contacts like Vader, he decided that he would kill his way through an entire Imperial garrison before he finally reached his target. And to make sure he still showed his face in the right criminal circles, he headed back to his base of operation in Jabba's palace. A great way to pick up on any rumors that Fett was slipping, and eliminate them publicly to ensure that they understood Boba was still the best in the galaxy. While here, he would also assist new hunters and spacers in tracking down their targets, becoming somewhat of a bounty broker himself, and we see that among Fett's accumulated treasures in his armory, he rewards one of the spacers with their choice of a DC-15A or 15S, weapons that were made famous by the clones of his father. At this time, the Rebel Alliance was still managing to survive against the all-out offensive being launched by the Empire, and to try and turn the entire underworld against the Rebels, Palpatine released the Emperor's Most Wanted list. Bounties of various credit amounts and varying levels of difficulties drew in all notable hunters from around the galaxy. While most went after the mid-ranking Rebel officers that fell right in the best pay-to-effort range, Fett decided to go after Rachi Sitra, who was thought to be the last surviving Jedi Knight. An incredible way for him to honor his father's legacy. Knowing Jango would have loved to see how the Jedi were destroyed by Order 66, imagine if Fett could be the one to kill the final living Jedi. His search would bring him to Dathomir. Hiding behind an asteroid, he would fire a single, perfectly placed shot that destroys the enemy hyperdrive system, allowing Slave One to swoop in and board. This all happened in a matter of seconds, and the Jedi didn't know what to expect, frantically had to ignite her sabers and prepare for defense. But as soon as the airlock opened, a wrist rocket was fired. An attempt to deflect with the blade merely caught the blast, allowing Boba to close in and get the energy binders around her wrists. If she resisted, or tried to manipulate anything through the Force, Boba could unleash an intensely painful burst. So she gave up and was taken to a remote prison on Tatooine. He was most likely torn with wanting to just kill her and end the Jedi, but he couldn't honor his father by disobeying the terms of a bounty contract. And this success would be followed by one of the most important captures of his career. Wanting to get revenge for his embarrassment at the hands of Renegade Squadron, he took a bounty on a high-ranking Rebel admiral. He stalked an Alliance scouting mission on the planet Seleucami and ambushed their ship, capturing every member of the crew, including one Admiral Akbar. The Calamari fetched an incredible bounty from the Empire, and he took the crew and sold them all into slavery under Jabba the Hutt. He knew that Han and Renegade Squadron would come to rescue them, so he placed trackers in them that would lead Fett to the Rebel secret base on Baz Pity. Here, the rebellion was nearly destroyed by the resulting Imperial Blitzkrieg, but the ever-slippery Han and his squad did escape. Though one of the hunters Fett had often used as a subcontractor actually managed to track Solo to the remote world of Hoth. But several days had passed before Fett got word of this, and by the time he went to rendezvous with his hunter, he found that Han had escaped. And upon getting down to the surface of the icy world, he was met only with the charred remains of the Battle of Hoth. Han had been a thorn in his side for years now, ever since Jabba made Han Solo the top smuggler, alongside Boba the top hunter. By being one of Vader's target and crossing Jabba, Fett had the all-clear to bring Han in. And although Fett was furious that Han kept eluding him, he could sense that his time would come soon. Darth Vader was also furious that so many key rebels had escaped the Battle of Hoth, and gathered the top hunters in the galaxy to finally bring Solo in.
You are free to use any methods necessary, but I want them alive. No disintegrations.
As you wish.
Boba had suspected that Han was using the garbage release to mask the Millennium Falcon, recognizing the trick from what Obi-Wan had done over Geonosis, tricking Boba and his dad by cutting off the electronics and attaching to an asteroid. So he tested this theory right after being dismissed by Vader, seeing the blue glow of the Falcon's engines as it kicked on and slipped away. Boba right there in Slave One, stalking him all the way to Bespin. Luckily for Fett, Han didn't jump through hyperspace, he just navigated from here to the mining colony on sublight engines. As soon as it was evident which planet he was going to, Fett contacted Vader to announce that he had Solo cornered. Imperial agents on Bespin would be activated, approaching Lando, telling him to set up Han, or be killed as a rebel sympathizer, and have his entire colony absorbed into the Empire. Lando was forced to set up his old friend. But moments before they would spring the trap, Boba had to deal with an unexpected enemy. IG-88B had a different strategy for finding Solo. He simply attached a tracker to Slave One after their meeting with Vader, and followed the best bounty hunter to Bespin. But Fett had picked up on this rival hunter's presence, and when IG thought he had Fett cornered in a room deep in the bowels of Bespin, Fett turned the ambush on him. As soon as the droid rushed into the room, 4 remote-activated ion cannons opened up on IG, followed by a major ion blast from Fett. He calmly walked up to the disabled droid and placed the droid's own concussion grenades inside of his torso casing, blasting IG-88B from the inside out. The droid's last input was hearing Fett coldly tell the Ugnaughts simply, quote, "You're welcome to what's left." Just a few hours later, Vader would spring their trap.
I had no choice. They arrived right before you did.
I'm sorry.
Han would be tortured to give up information on the Rebel Alliance, and this whole operation was not going as explained to Lando.
He's no good to me dead.
He will not be permanently damaged.
That was never a condition of our agreement, nor was giving hand to this bounty hunter!
Vader still needed to use Han as bait, and also wanted to make sure that the carbon freezing facilities here were precise enough to keep a specimen alive. So he would test it on Han to make sure it would work in capturing Luke, being the safest way to transport him to the Emperor. Moments later, Boba would transport his prize bounty to the carbonite chamber, and we see he is still concerned with Vader's impromptu plan.
What if he doesn't survive? He's worth a lot to me.
The Empire will compensate you if he dies.
When the carbonite hardened, Lando checks on the vitals, and reports Han was still alive.
He's all yours, bounty hunter.
Luke Skywalker had just landed, and Boba is given a retinue of troopers to assist in the transport of Han to Slave One. And in the halls of the facility, Boba's sensors would alert him to someone sneaking around behind him, doubling back and blasting at Luke with his EE-3 rifle. Narrowly missing, most likely on purpose, knowing Vader meant to capture him alive.
Put Captain Solo in the cargo hold.
As Slave One was lifting off, Chewie and Leia burst out and opened fire, but these blaster bolts are harmlessly absorbed. Fett flying away victorious, he finally had the annoying smuggler that had evaded him for years now. But he would not take the trophy directly to Jabba. It would be months of traveling around the galaxy before he finally delivered Solo. And in that time, he was being tracked by both Lando and Chewbacca, and the copies of IG-88C, and 88D. Han's friend received a tip that Bossk would know where Fett was, but they would spend weeks chasing down dead ends, finding neither hunter. The droids did catch up with Fett, however, laying in wait in the ship IG-2000, engaging Slave One in an intense dogfight to try and steal Han, the bounty their droid brother had died trying to secure. Boba only survived by understanding that each enemy and situation required their own unique response. For these droids, he couldn't use his excellent piloting skills. He had to fly erratically and use his weapons illogically, something that the droids could not compute, causing them to crash just trying to keep up with him. The Slave One was still heavily damaged, forcing him to flee and make an emergency landing on the planet Gaul. Another Corellian smuggler named Dash Rendar was hired by Lando to try and hunt down Solo as well, and he caught wind of Boba's iconic ship making a rush landing and seeking extensive repairs. He hurried over to ambush Fett, and was able to destroy his jetpack and then further damage Slave One, forcing the ship back into an underground hangar, though this did allow Boba to evade Dash Rendar. This was reported to Lando, and he and Chewbacca rushed to this world in the Falcon. They were just minutes away from discovering Slave One and rescuing Han, but 4-LOM had also received a tip that Fett was on Gaul, and was currently trying to find a way to break into his ship. Slave One's sensors alerted Boba, and he came rushing over. Fett blasted 4-LOM and his henchmen, but this world proved to be too hot, so he immediately left, 4-LOM inadvertently foiling Lando and Chewie's rescue mission. The bounty on Han's head was so high that all of the top hunters were willing to try and steal this carbonite slab, and Fett's ship was still not fully repaired. He tried to hide out in a remote asteroid field, but 4-LOM was able to repair himself and get off a transmission to Zuckuss and Bossk. The Slave One detected this outgoing transmission, and the droid was blasted for good this time. Now Fett had to brace himself for the incoming attack. They all ambushed Slave One, and were able to board it when Bossk commanded the strike team from the Houndstooth. Fett was able to capture 4-LOM, Zuckuss, and kill off all of their friends. He would put a blaster to Zuckuss' head, and force him to call Bossk, saying that they had captured Solo and were returning on their shuttle. When Bosk's co-pilot went to the Houndstooth's hangar, he thought he was giving the strike team a victorious welcome back, but he looked inside the shuttle to find them all dead, just as a bundle of thermal detonators went off, destroying almost everything inside of the hangar. Bossk survived, and Boba went to find another hiding place, setting up inside the remains of a derelict CR-90, where he would finally be able to get the Slave One fully operational. Zuckuss and 4-LOM were complaining in their cells, claiming he would never be able to get Solo to Jabba, that all the hunters would kill him as soon as he showed up. So when the time finally came to set down on the sandy world, he made sure Slave One was miles away from the palace, and had Zuckuss dressed in a spare suit of armor. He was then chained into position on a speeder bike, which was towing a small hover trailer. Here he placed the scrapped 4-LOM and placed a covering over him. This decoy was sent at the main entrance to the palace, while Fett would sneak into the place he thought of as home from the time he was orphaned. This trick allowed him to enter the palace unchallenged, walking Solo right up to the ecstatic hut. Jabba considered this a piece of art, and Boba agreed that this was not about the scum Solo, but rather this base human was used as a medium through which the Dark Lord Vader had crafted this masterpiece. Jabba paid out 2.5 times the bounty just because he loved that he could display this work in his throne room, a fitting testament to the Hutt's power. Even those that found themselves in his graces, like his top smuggler, they had to worry about his top hunter, Boba, who would always track you down eventually. And for Fett, this was the end of an 8-year hunt for revenge, ever since Han and Lando embarrassed him by using his own neurotoxin on him. To make it even better, Jabba said that he would pay a great sum to have Boba stick around for a while to protect his work of art, knowing his rebel allies may come and try to rescue him. The only missions Boba would take over the next year would be for Jabba on Tatooine, back to small stakes stuff like fixing demolition game tournaments. In the year 4 ABY, Fett and Jabba were shocked to hear that the UB's bounty hunter Bausch had managed to capture Chewbacca. Most hunters knew of him, but he was a very obscure character. He would use a thermal detonator to try and get some more credits for the bounty, and we see just how quick Fett was on the draw in this security role. Once they agreed on terms, Jabba laughed and respected this style, and even the most notorious hunter in the galaxy made a point to give him a nod. Proud for Bausch and this surprising boom for his career. The only problem was that this was Han Solo's rebel ally, Leia Organa. Bausch had only recently died in some remote part of the galaxy, and almost no one in the galaxy got the news. That night, Leia would make her way to the wall art, but Boba did not take his role as palace security lightly. Just seconds after Han was thawed out of carbonite, the trap was sprung.
I know that laugh.
Boba was there listening as the blind and weak Solo was frantically pleading for his miserable life. Han would be thrown into a dungeon with his partner, while Leia was put in a revealing slave outfit. To reward Fett for this capture, Jabba sent Leia to his chambers that night, ordering her to entertain the hunter. But Boba felt that his Mandalorian code did not permit him to do so. He also knew that to send her back would be an insult to Jabba, so instead he allowed her to stay there and even gave her his bed, while he slept on the floor. All the while, Leia lectured him on the sins of the Empire, but Boba struck back with a list of rebel attacks that spread their own misery. Though something of her talk of fighting for the peoples crushed by the monoculture of the centralized empire struck a nerve with Boba. Perhaps thinking of his own Mandalorian people, he lost his cool, angrily screaming at the princess-turned-rebel to just shut up and go to sleep. The following day, a Jedi in all black would seek an audience with Jabba. As this man tried his mind tricks, Fett was right there at the Hutt's side, eager to defend his patron and strike down Luke in an instant. Seeing Skywalker as just another one of those sorcerer vermin that should have been long extinct by now. When the Jedi was dropped into the Rancor pit, they all thought they were in for a great show. Boba eagerly looks over to see Skywalker be ripped apart by the beast. But the Jedi was resourceful, and though victorious, this only angered Jabba further. Luke, Han, and Chewbacca would all be sentenced to death by Sarlacc, and Boba listened as the horrible details of this punishment were relayed.
You will therefore be taken to the Dune Sea and cast into the pit of Carkoon, the nesting place of the all-powerful Sarlacc. In his belly you will find a new definition of pain and suffering, as you are slowly digested over 1,000 years.
Fett stayed vigilant as they made their way to the pit, but there were variables he was unaware of. The blue and white astromech unit contained the Jedi's blade, and Lando Calrissian had secretly worked his way into Jabba's guard. On the plank, Skywalker put his plan into motion, and this Jedi, this remnant of a dead order, sprang into action and started slicing through the guards. Fett moved in, igniting his jetpack to bring him to the skiff, but the Force was strong with this one. Luke whips around and severs the EE-3, but Fett is able to wrap him up with the whipcord, though Fett's own allies provide the Jedi with a means to separate him. Firing away with their heavy blaster cannons, the lightsaber deflects this bolt, just narrowly missing Boba, but does work to knock him down. He gets to his feet just as Han is whipped into a panic at the mere mention of the hunter's name. While Boba was firing with his wrist blaster, Han's luck strikes again. In this panic, he swings his staff blindly and strikes the jetpack, causing it to malfunction and send Boba smashing into the side of Jabba's barge, knocking him unconscious before he tumbles right into the Sarlacc. Like his father before him, this defeat came because of a malfunctioning jetpack. But unlike his father, Boba wasn't dead yet. When he opens his eyes, he finds he is in hell, and what burned was not fire, but the acid of a Sarlacc's stomach. This creature was no simple organism. It was able to absorb the brains of its prey and keep them alive for thousands of years, containing chemicals that would sustain life, alter it, and absorb it. The victim slowly being integrated into the Sarlacc itself. To have reached this size, the Lord of the Great Pit of Carkoon had taken hundreds, if not thousands of lives. Everything from Eope to humans, and even at least one Jedi over its lifetime, had been absorbed into a sort of collective consciousness. Through this biological integration process, Fett started to detect the thoughts of the Sarlacc's first victim, a sentient alien named Suseo. He was eaten over 4,000 years ago, and loved to pick the mind of Fett, this bounty hunter raised in the Mandalorian tradition, reading his thoughts concerning the fate of the Jedi and the rise of this new order to replace the Republic. Fett knew the clock was ticking, and he was slowly being absorbed into the Sarlacc, and would come to think of himself as a Sarlacc, much like this mind speaking to him now. The acids were also destroying his armor and equipment, so he thought up a way to manipulate this ruler of hell. By insulting Suseo and tempting him to show him his strength, he got the being to constrict the walls of a chamber Fett was being processed in. The jetpack that had delivered him here would be his ticket out of the underworld. As it was crushed and exploded, Fett added to this damage by throwing all of his grenades and explosives towards this site, blasting a small hole in the side of the being. Fett forcing himself through this bloodied opening to free himself from this underworld and be rebirthed into the world of the living. He scrambled up the pit and ran aimlessly over the sand dunes, before he eventually collapsed. A combination of exhaustion, starvation, and dehydration with this abrupt severance from the Sarlacc. He lay unconscious in the sand only to be detected by the Jawa. They saw this grotesque, slime-covered being and assumed it must be a strange sort of droid that was vomited up by the Sarlacc. They slapped a restraining bolt on the curiosity and threw it in the holding quarters of their sandcrawler. If his luck couldn't get any worse, this sandcrawler was then attacked by a major Tusken Raider force, critically damaging the vehicle and sending it on a crash course with the Sarlacc. It seemed like he would be sent right back to the depths, but when this vehicle exploded, it sent him out and left him in the sands unconscious again. Luckily, his old ally Dengar had come to search through the remains of Jabba's sail barge, knowing it could contain some pretty valuable loot, and inadvertently discovered the alive but motionless Fett. This was one of the only other top hunters in the galaxy that didn't want Fett dead, and he brought him aboard his ship, punishing one. Seconds after this, bombers screamed overhead and obliterated much of the Dune Sea, focusing on the pit of Carkoon. The leader of Kuat Drive Yards, the Kuat of Kuat, had called in this bombing run to ensure that Fett was dead, having heard the rumors of Jabba's debacle. The Kuat was desperately trying to keep his planet and their shipyards independent from Imperial rule, and Fett was seen as just below Vader in terms of who enforced the Emperor's will. Thanks to Dengar, he narrowly escaped this death as well, but Boba was so damaged from his time in the Sarlacc that he had to spend days in a nutrient sack that repaired his body. Decades earlier, a young Boba would lead Dengar on several bounty missions. Now Dengar was keeping Fett alive and punishing one's medbay, and telling him how his bounty against the rebellious Kuat could align their interests. Boba wanted the galaxy to think he was dead, so instead of recovering Slave 1, he worked with Dengar to track down Bosk. Boba would actually hijack the Trandoshan's iconic ship, the Houndstooth, and use it to travel to Kuat Drive Yards. But when he arrived, the orbital shipyard was exploding. The Kuat had felt there was no way out. The Imperial noose had been slowly tightening for decades, and the only move left was to deny them their shipyards, which had managed to remain independent since their creation thousands of years ago. Fett was able to locate Kuat's ship and boarded it before he had a chance to take off. After questioning him on his motives behind bombing the Dune Sea, Fett forced the Kuat out, leaving him to be consumed by the explosives he had placed with his own hands, while Fett rushed to cut off the chain reaction before it blew apart the entire orbital ring. With Boba's efforts, he was able to save 80% of Kuat Drive Yards. Right after this mission, Boba would receive news that was nearly impossible to process. Reports claimed that the Sith Lord Darth Vader, who had given him so many lucrative contracts over the decades, and even the Emperor himself, had died during the Battle of Endor, going down in another one of those moon-sized battle stations. To compound this loss, Slave 1 was discovered and taken to an impound lot controlled by what was now referred to as the New Republic. Later this year, Fett was approached by a droid hunter named 8T88, who tried to get Boba to eliminate the Jedi who had bested him a year earlier, Kyle Katarn. But Fett did not take that defeat personally, and was a wise enough bounty hunter to decide it was not worth it. No point in making himself an enemy of the victor of the Galactic Civil War. During this time, he acquired a ship he would name the Slave 2, which was a model produced by Mandel Motors, and used most often as a policing ship on Mandalore. He allowed the galaxy to go on believing that he was still being digested by the Sarlacc, while completing jobs from the more discreet Slave 2. At this time, many younger hunters were tempted to try and claim to be the infamous Boba Fett. but one who actually tried it was named Jodo Kast. He got himself some knockoff Mandalorian armor, and when Fett caught wind of this, he set up an elaborate trap. Boba would pose as both the patron and target. The patron was trying to take the identity of the target, and Boba knew if Kast went through with this man was utterly unscrupulous, being given this mirror to see how ugly his own actions were, and still going through with them. When this faux Boba shows up to eliminate the target, Fett comes forth and engages him, and thought that if he wanted to act like a Fett, he can suffer the Fett's Achilles heel, and fired at Jodo Kast's jetpack, causing it to explode. For the next 4 years, Fett would lay low and just ensure that his reputation was not further insulted. But now in 8 BBY, he would get news that Han Solo was not just alive, but had risen to become a general in the New Republic army. And even Emperor Palpatine survived through the sorcery of the Sith and the science of the cloners. Fett would take the Emperor's contract on Solo and get in touch with Dengar to help him. They would ambush Han on Nar Shaddaa, but he found that the smuggler's luck was still with him. But they were able to track him down to the core world of Biss, where Solo tried to use the planetary shield cycle to cut off his pursuers. Though Fett assured Dengar they would make it through, this was no Slave One, and the shields flickered back and Fett smashed into them. Dengar thought Fett had lost it, and that he had nearly gotten him killed, angrily breaking up their partnership and swearing to never work together again. Months would pass, and Fett tried to capture Solo on a remote moon, but this time Chewie saved the day. He got the jump on Fett, knocked off his helmet, and ignited his jetpack, smashing the human's head up against the ceiling. Boba was lucky to not be paralyzed, only lying unconscious from the head trauma. Fett still didn't want to give up. He tracked down the location of Slave One and liberated it from the NR compound, and lay in wait in the poison gas clouds of Nal Hutta. But the Millennium Falcon had just been upgraded with a powerful new form of lightning gun that was able to instantly disable Fett's iconic ship, sending it spiraling out of control and nearly resulting in the simultaneous death of the notorious Hunter and the ship that had symbolized the Fetts. The next 2 years would be quiet as well, and in the year 10 ABY, Boba was now 42 years old, with over 32 years of deadly combat. It seemed he wanted to slow down, but a man named Sleek wanted him to avenge the near extinction of his people at the hands of the Imperial Remnant. Several Imperial commanders were terrorizing a part of space from their death ship. The bounty would be the entire collective wealth of the Gulmarid's people, totaling 100 credits. This pitiful sum was insulting at first, but Boba eventually agrees, Silk playing on Fett's pride and honor, saying that if he could slay this entire group of commanders, the Fett name would be put back into its proper place of galactic notoriety, reclaiming his infamy after his defeat on Tatooine, while also avenging a people that the Empire tried to extinguish, just as they had tried with the Mandalorians. Fett would eventually kill each and every member of this Imperial Remnant group, and brought all of their heads to the Gulmarids, and of course, still collected his token 100 credit payment. Later this year, he would be back in the service of the Hutts, Gorga the Hutt. Jabba was a sort of adopted father, the only one Fett thought he could trust in the years after Jango died. He had no love for these Hutts, and demanded outrageous sums of credits from them, taking numerous missions from them over the next 3 years, including the saving of the Hutt's wife, killing off several pirates, and even killing Gorga's father-in-law. Now in the year 13 ABY, Fett was again pitted against the Imperial Remnant. The most dedicated and dangerous of the restored Empire were called the Imperial Hardliners. Their leader, Enix Devian, hired Fett to eliminate a rival Imperial survivor named Kur Kanos. Kanos was a former Imperial Royal Guard who survived to serve even the reborn Emperor, but was now in hiding, using the name Kenix Kill as he operated as a bounty hunter in this fractured state of the galaxy. Boba tracked him down to his apartment where these two lifetime warriors battled it out, leaving the entire dwelling destroyed and covered in each other's blood. Eventually, Boba is able to convince him that he was not there to kill him, but to bring him to Devian and the Hardliners, that this was a fellow imp trying to rebuild Palpatine's vision. At this, Kanos agrees to come in. The following year, Boba would have another encounter with a relic of a destroyed order, this time the Jedi. Jaden Korr was being trained under Luke Skywalker's new Jedi Order, a grotesque manifestation that all grew out of that Jedi that had defeated Boba. If Boba could have just cut down Skywalker that day, he may have finally brought about an end to this Force cult. This single failure was undoing all of his father's life work, something that surely haunted Boba. On the planet Ord Mantell, Boba was tasked with protecting a store of weapons that this Jedi sought to destroy.
This doesn't concern you, Jedi. Just walk away.
The battle that ensued would be the first time Fett fought against the Jedi since that fateful day on Tatooine, and again this would be a loss, as the Force wielder also wielded some pretty heavy weaponry, and Fett saw that this battle was not worth fighting.
No bounties on you. A shame.
And when this Jedi contacted his allies, we see that Kyle Katarn remembers his run-in with a hunter more than a decade ago.
I ran into him once myself back on Coruscant, just barely got out alive.
And 5 years later, we see what Boba may have been sensing in himself, what had been slowing him down. Boba had been battling a cancer that had developed from the alterations to his biology by the Sarlacc. He had a leg amputated to stop the spread, but the tumors were still popping up. The credits that he had accumulated over his entire life were now quickly disappearing in this fight to keep off death. He hated his prosthetic leg, and was now unable to afford a cloned replacement due to the constant and expensive treatments. In this time of less action and violence, we see a more philosophical side of Fett, where he looked over his life and how it affected so many others. How Boba sought to resolve this seeming disparity between being a hired killer and one bound to honor. He felt that his father, himself, and the Mandalorian tradition that they claimed to uphold all employed force to remove those who were evil. Evil defined as those that threatened the very fabric of civilization, and thus life itself. These targets had all cheated, lied, stole, murdered, or at the very least were too weak to rule. Too weak and idealistic to have a plan in place in case their enemies hired someone like Boba Fett, and thus they would be too weak to maintain control and hold off the creeping entropy that sought to eventually remove life from the universe. I want to read a direct quote from Boba Fett so you can hear this philosophy in his own words. Quote, "Evil exists. It is intelligence in the service of entropy. When the side of a mountain slides to kill a village, this is not evil, for evil requires intent. Should a sentient being cause that landslide, there is evil, and requires justice as a consequence, so that civilization can exist. There is no greater good than justice, and only if law serves justice is it a good law. It is said correctly that law exists not for the just, but for the unjust. For the just carry the law in their hearts, and do not need to call it from afar. I bow to no one, and give service only for cause." Fett saw this cancer as entropy, the ordered good of his body going to disorder, if not conscious and evil. But all would agree that the Deveronian criminal known as the Butcher of Montelon-Serrat was true evil. A bounty for an incredible 5 million credits brought Boba back into the hunt. The man's security was impeccable, detecting even the smallest weapons, explosives, or droids. It would take weeks of observation and slow moving towards the compound, with no weapons on him except for a wooden crossbow. When the Deveronian came out to urinate, Fett hit him with a bolt to the shoulder and then in the hamstring. He closed in and tied the target up and then made his way out to the Slave 4, Fett's current ship that was the exact model that his father used before acquiring Slave 1, in which Jango named Jaster's Legacy. Boba got his 5 million, and this target was sentenced to a slow and painful execution on his homeworld. But before his death, he pleaded with Boba to turn in all of his musical works to the Coruscant University School of Music. A wish that Fett fulfilled, resulting in the rediscovery of many works thought completely erased by the Empire. With this incredible bounty, he was on his way to purchase a clone leg, when he ran into none other than Han Solo. Boba's next stop was his homeworld of Kamino, and this battle with his own body was changing him. Though he and Solo were both suspicious of each other, Boba assured him that he was willing to let go. This pit stop was on the world Jubilar. Coincidentally, if you believe in such a phenomena, it was the same planet Boba had first met Solo, but was now 31 years ago. Solo agreed, and was stunned to hear that Fett was saying that he retired from the life of bounty hunting, and he ended the conversation by saying, quote, "Perhaps, Han Solo, we should let fly, and once more let fate decide who survives, as we did when we were young." The next stop was Kamino. A surge of memories came back, from his childhood, to cherished moments with his father, to later times with the Dark Lord Vader and the Empire. He was happily surprised to see that the Kaminoan that was the closest thing he ever had to a mother, Taun We, was still alive. She and Fett would talk about the decades that had passed, how much they and the galaxy at large had so dramatically changed, but she had a request that Fett could not turn down. Despite his retirement, Taun We pleaded with him to hunt down a man named Fen Shiza. To complicate things, she claimed that this man called himself the Mandalore, the sole ruler and leader of the Mandalorian Protectors, a group that was very similar to the true Mandalorians that saved Jango as a boy. These Mandos considered themselves the only actual Mandalorians in the galaxy. The others were all perverted by outside forces and devoid of all honor and valor. Fett would never know this, but Fen Shiza took over the organization after it had been built up by Spar, a clone trooper that Jango Fett had helped escape Kamino before the Clone Wars. It would take 4 years for Boba to catch up to this so-called Mandalore on the planet Shogun. They would fight to the death, but the exact details of this battle were covered up by Fett. All that was revealed was that Shiza went to his death nobly, but had one shocking demand: that Boba honor their Mandalorian traditions, and himself take up the mantle of Mandalore. This was the ultimate goal that Jango had placed on Boba before he was even born, Jango seeing this son as the last remaining hope for the future of the Mandalorian people. It seemed everything had aligned itself to put Boba in this position, at this precise time in history. In this year, 23 ABY, Boba, who is now 55 years old, had marked an official end to his 45-year bounty hunting career, and the start of his new position as sole ruler. The Protectors enthusiastically welcomed him, and eventually he was heralded as the ruler of the Mandalorian Empire. Spar had kept alive the stories of the heroic actions of Jango Fett, and the Mandalorian people were primed to place the son on the throne. And just 2 years later, the galaxy would be under siege from the greatest threat to date. The Yuuzhan Vong War had begun. A Vong leader named Nam Anor sought out the Mandalore's council. He explained that they were aware of how the Jedi, Republic, and later Empire all oppressed the Mandalorian people. He offered Fett a chance at revenge. Aid the Vong in their conquest of the galaxy, and Mandalorian space would remain independent. But the Force, or Mandalorian war gods, put the right Mandalorian in power at the right time. Where many Mando predecessors would have jumped at the chance to burn down the galaxy for revenge, Fett knew better. The Mandalorians would simply be the last to be eliminated, and so for now he had to fake an alliance. Fett brought his top lieutenant on board the Vong ship with him, while Anor explained the Mando's place in their vision of the future. Fett scanned the entire ship, while Lieutenant Goran gathered physical samples of the Vong's unique organic ships. Fett's own ship, the Slave One, was fully restored again, and he would use his military forces to capture targets identified by the Vong overlords. But instead of being amoral mercenaries like the Mandos of old, and instead of just being used and betrayed like the times they were allies with the ancient Sith, or later Republic, Boba played along with these powerful extragalactic invaders, while feeding intel to the New Republic. Each mission the Vong assigned them, Boba would secretly provide details to the NR, allowing them to set up counterattacks and anticipate their moves. Boba's lifetime of skills as a warrior, countless bounties where he had to take in targets alive instead of dead, allowed him to appear as the same old conquering Mandalore, while still upholding his code of honor. All of his assigned targets were taking out using lightning-fast deployment of his Protector special forces, destroying a city's defenses and capturing key VIPs alive, forcing the population to surrender before bloodshed could break out. The Yuuzhan Vong thought Boba Fett the Mandalore was merely being a great tactician, only concerned with preventing the loss of his own men. But he told his top commanders that the only way playing along with the Vong could be honorable is if minimal innocents died. As the Vong's push for the galactic core intensified, Fett would send reports to the NR of cities that were about to be struck, advising their immediate evac. Sometimes this was listened to, other times it was not, and there were times he was forced to watch as the Vong's massive organic ships absorbed matter from the cities, using it to repair itself and generate fuel. Boba came to see the Yuuzhan Vong race as one massive Sarlacc, a conscious bringer of entropy, an evil that wanted to devour the whole galaxy, bring all its sentience under its will. All life would be slowly digested and turned into Vong. The fear of this new threat, and the respect he had for the position of Mandalore, allowed him to even see past his hatred for the Jedi. On one mission, a Vong warrior would command Fett and a Mandalorian commando named Bevan to kill a Jedi. The Vong was just minutes behind him, and Fett frantically tries to convince the Jedi that the Mandos were not his enemy, giving him crucial intel of the next attack and ordering him to bring it to the NR leadership. Boba Fett helps this Jedi escape, and when the Vong warrior returns eager to see the Jedi's corpse, Bevan uses the ancient Mando weapon the Crush Gaunts to brutally kill the monster, collecting more samples from him, and even taking his scalp as a trophy. But in this fight, a Mando named Brika was mortally wounded. She would die before they could evac via Slave One, though her efforts did help to prevent other Vong from seeing Boba's betrayal. Some days later, Slave One would be approached by an X-Wing and hailed on its comms. The Jedi says his name was Kubaret, and thanks him for saving his life. The NR now has full faith in the Mandalorian allies, and explains that he was sent to ask Boba to create a new Kueval Dar. replicating the structure Jango Fett developed to train the clones on Kamino. The NR wanted Boba to spare some of his top commandos to train planetary militias across the galaxy. An entire galaxy trained in the Mandalorian warrior traditions was now their only hope. Fett tells this Jedi that he had lost a Mando trying to cover his escape, to make sure that the NR knows that Mandalorians have died trying to save this galaxy, and that if they want their help, the Mandalorian Code of Honor would not be some tool of the politicians on Coruscant, but an ethic that would be held in the hearts of countless beings across the galaxy. To be a Mandalorian never had anything to do with race, species, or birthplace. It was a creed, a way of life. Boba Fett accepted this proposition to build a new Queveldar, turning the Mandalorians into the true protectors of the galaxy. This was the ultimate iteration of Jaster Muriel's ideals, those principles that Jango felt saved by, principles he hoped Boba would keep alive and grow. The sect that called itself the True Mandalorians had broken away from the pacifists, because they felt it was unethical to leave yourself weak and at the whims of evil, and they split with Death Watch, seeing Vizsla's path as one of blind might makes right destruction. Instead, the True Mandalorian faction was to be the sheepdog, strong and powerful enough to fight off the wolves, but never starting any wars themselves. A warrior for self-defense, not conquest. Boba took his role as Mandalore and this threat from the Vong to bring about that vision. In the final 2 years of the war, from 28 to 29 ABY, Fett's forces, the NR, and those planetary militias were able to turn the tide against these alien invaders. But the Vong saw Fett as a traitor, and threw everything they had at destroying the planet Mandalore. Most of the surface was leveled by singularity bombardments, though a majority of the population was able to survive this by retreating into their underground tunnel system. But when the Vong landed their warriors on the surface, the Mandos were forced to rush out and confront them. The Vong would lose millions and be forced to retreat, but victory came at the cost of 1.5 million Mandalorians. One commenter said, quote, "That might be nothing for Coruscant, but for us, it was devastating. In fact, it represented a loss of 1/3 of the population of Mandalore." The biological samples Boba had ordered collected did allow them to develop weapons that were specifically targeted for the Vong biology and their organic ships. And the final push to remove them from the galaxy would see Boba allied with NR General Han Solo. Together, these two favorites of scum like Jabba the Hutt were celebrated as heroes by trillions of their galactic brothers and sisters. But while the galaxy celebrated, Boba and his experts surveyed the destruction of Mandalore, and they saw things were worse than they could have ever imagined. Most of the Vong's targets would be kept viable so that they could later be terraformed, but the Vong wanted the complete destruction of Mandalore. Almost all of their farmable land and natural water reserves were poisoned. Countless animal and plant species were now extinct, and almost all of their cities needed to be demolished and rebuilt. For the next 10 years, Boba Fett, their Mandalore, and all of the Mandalorian people worked tirelessly to try and reclaim their planet. Even after a decade, most farms were still unrecoverable, and the capital, Keldabe, was still just a shadow of its former self. So many beings died here that it left an imprint in the Force. All those attuned to it would be overwhelmed by the fear and sadness, the screams of millions lost. Heavy rains would often expose the bones of the dead, both Mando and Vong relics washing into towns, acting as a psychological horror for the survivors, making them doubt if they could ever leave this time behind them, being literally unable to bury their past. And then a new, more insidious form of cruelty. The New Republic had been in political turmoil following the war, and Boba watched in shock and disgust at how these pathetic politicians turned their back on the ally that saved the galaxy. By the year 40 ABY, all forms of aid to Mandalore were completely shut down, following what had only been a pitiful sum even at its height. Perhaps he was foolish to think that the galaxy could act honorably, but he did not lose faith in his people. A popular movement was sweeping through his people known as Kadikla, which was created by a veteran of the Vong War, and was promoted across their world as Mandalore First. Boba called the meeting of the clans, and they agreed on new policies that would ensure they would not be involved in the galaxy at large, at least not until they had fully revitalized their home. As Mandalore, he issued a call for his people to come home. 2 million Mandoade, children of Mandalore, to help with the restoration effort. And this is where we have to remember that millennia earlier, the discovery of Beskar iron by the earliest of Mandalorians was seen as proof of covenant with their ancient war gods. this seemingly magic metal that could repel lightsabers and yet be workable to create armor and weapons. But their people had been without Beskar for decades now. The veins all run dry, a fact seen as symbolic of the loss of the Mandalorian spirit during the subjugation of the Empire, and the anarchy that came with its fall. With Boba's call to restore Mandalore, the ancient gods seemed to be pleased with this new ruler, as a geologist and minerals engineer that answered Boba's call discovered that one of the Vong's singularity bombs unearthed an enormous vein of Beskar iron ore. By doing what Fett thought was honorable, rightly opposing the Vong and focusing on uniting his people, he had brought Beskar back to the Mandalorians. This discovery, and the assistance of the recalled Mandawade, helped to create a Mandalore that was greater than it had ever been in history. Boba Fett had fully restored the Mandalorian spirit. At this point, Fett was 72 years old, and though he expected to live past a century, he was feeling ill and headed to Kamino. He found that his mother figure Taun We had left the watery world, but that Kosai could help him. It was here on his homeworld that he made 3 promises to himself: that he would find his daughter Aelin Vel, find a Mandalore that could replace him, and find a way to cheat death for as long as possible. Kosai's research aimed at reversing the accelerated aging process. He thought if this was possible, could her research also be used to prolong life? And in tracking her down, he also came across reports that someone was again impersonating him, wearing his armor and traveling about the galaxy taking bounty contracts. They weren't exactly hurting his reputation. In fact, they were pretty good at it. This imposter had taken a bounty against the Solo family, but he also had his mission of tracking down his daughter. And in this process, he actually found out that he had a granddaughter named Murda Gev. She explained how her grandma said that she had found a way to forgive Boba many years ago. But for Aelin, it was much more difficult. Boba asking, quote, "Tell me something about Aelin. Was she ever happy?" To which his granddaughter replied, quote, "I don't think so." Boba would get in touch with Solo to tell him of this imposter trying to take him out. And together, they went and eliminated the man that ordered this contract, with Murda Gev actually firing the final shot, earning Solo's appreciation and respect. But victory was short. Solo's son Jacen had fallen to the dark side, and he had killed this Fett lookalike that was pursuing him. When the helmet was removed, they would learn that this was Aelin Fett. Boba's daughter had never forgiven him for the abandonment, devastated when she learned that he was alive, but for 50 years never once came to see her. The man that could track down anyone in the galaxy never put any time into finding her. Her mother, Sintis Vel, tried to explain, but Aelin saw it all as excuses. This was not how he wanted to find her, and Boba was devastated. He could save the entire Mandalorian people, but not his own family. Fett experienced a flash of rage, but suppressed it. He would not kill Jacen Solo. He knew that Han was more devastated than he could be, watching as his son was consumed by the dark side. But this was a test for Han. They would take Aelin's body on Slave 1, and headed to the Petronaki Arena on Geonosis, Boba explaining the significance of this place to his granddaughter. They would exhume Jango's remains, and place them in a simple wooden box that matched Aelin, taking them to be buried side by side in a graveyard outside of Keldabe, Jango's final resting place on the capital of Mandalore, at the side of a granddaughter he never got to meet. Aelin had thought her mother died during a bounty, her body never to be recovered, but granddaughter Gev says that she had recovered information on the whereabouts of Sintas and Carbonite, along with rumors of another hunter in Mandalorian armor, one that even shared Boba's face. He knew this must be a clone that was somehow still alive, at what should have been a biological age of 140. Surely he was using Kosai's research. Boba would be able to track him down and reveal that he was Jang Skarada, one of those original clones that was directly raised by Jango, and his top advisor, Cal Skarada. Though he denied any advanced medical aid, he secretly had Boba injected with a chemical while he slept, which would function to repair DNA and his bone marrow, before this clone disappeared, never to be seen by Fett again. Boba was never altered to have the age acceleration like the other clones, so this boost on an already normal biology would greatly extend his life, though Fett didn't even know he received it. Later this year, Boba would hear that Mara Jade Skywalker, wife to Luke and powerful member of the new Jedi Order, was killed by Jacen Solo. Boba still had no love for the Jedi, but knew that this was a horrific thing for a son to kill the wife of his closest friend. He couldn't imagine how Han was being ripped apart, and sent him his condolences in the only way a Mando could. Boba had the top blacksmiths in Keldabe create chest plates, a blade, and crush gaunts, and sent them to Solo with a letter that explained that they were all made with proper Beskar. and to be used to, quote, throttle the life out of his vermin spawn, ending the note, quote, with deepest sympathies. He knew what it was to be a father full of regret. When Murda confirmed Sintas's location, Boba gave her the credits necessary to buy her, and had her delivered to the top doctor on Mandalore. He warned that after so many years, she may have suffered irreversible damage, and when she was thawed, Sintas was blind, and even suffered some memory loss, though she did still remember how angry she was at Boba, but said she didn't care about any of that all these decades later. She was just happy to be back with him. By this time, Solo's daughter Jaina had sought out Boba to train her to defeat her brother Jacen. Imagine if the Fett of 30 years ago could have seen Boba as Mandalore on the thriving world of Mandalore, helping to train a Jedi Solo. And she even brought a Jedi friend. The Force works in mysterious ways, and as if payment for Boba's letting go of his hatred for the Order, the former Jedi turned Mandalorian by the name Gotab. This Jedi ally says that he could heal Sintas. Jaina would work with him over a period of days and then weeks to eventually fully restore Sintas' sight and memories. At this point, Jacen Solo was now a Lord of the Sith, going by the title Darth Caedus, and Fett explained to Jaina that she alone was responsible for fixing this. Fett, Murda, Jaina, and the Mandalorian commandos would encounter her brother several times, but the Sith always escaped. This continued during the years of 41 and 42 ABY, which also saw Boba preside over the wedding of his granddaughter and a Mandalorian warrior, Murda becoming a deadly Spec Ops Mando, and Jaina sent back to the Order to combine her Mando skills with more Jedi training. To bring down Darth Caedus, Solo's son that had killed Fett's daughter, Boba would have to work alongside the man that had sent him into that Sarlacc hell all those years ago. He would be shoulder to shoulder with Luke Skywalker. The Mandalore and the Jedi Grandmaster together launched an attack that they hoped would end this conflict called the Second Galactic Civil War. They would get Jaina to Caedus, while the Mandalorians would eliminate the Moffs that were all in a meeting over Fondor. But miscommunication between the Jedi team and the Mandos resulted in Murda getting to Darth Caedus before backup, and she was force lifted and smashed into the ground, paralyzed from her neck down. When the fallen brother saw the combined forces approaching, he fled, taking Murda with him. Boba assumed his granddaughter was dead, and let off his rage for the first time in years, blaming the Jedi for the loss of his daughter, and now his granddaughter. He wanted to kill them all, but he knew Jaina Solo was good. Knew deep down that things like this do happen in the fog of war. Meanwhile, the Dark Lord was using his skills in the Force to implant thoughts in Murda that Fett saw her as disposable, sent her on a suicide mission, and cared as little for her as he did for her grandmother and for her mother, Aaylan. He plied her for information about the Mandalorians, and then used a new bioweapon developed by this new empire. A nanovirus that could create deadly diseases that would only target genetic relatives. He took a sample of Murda's blood, and produced a weapon he hoped could finally kill Boba Fett. Darth Caedus got word that Boba was back on Mandalore, and sent an armada to the Mandalorian world. They were met with stiff opposition, but their goal was never to actually invade, just to infect. The virus was pumped into the atmosphere in enormous quantities. The scientists reported that every breath of air on this world would now contain at least a single viron, and that's all it would take to kill a Fett. Luckily, Boba had not made it home yet. He was still in transit through hyperspace, and his biologists warned him that this bioweapon was aimed at him. When he arrived, he stayed in orbit, though it wasn't long before he got word that his alliance with the Jedi had served its purpose. Jaina Solo had successfully defeated her brother, Aaylan was avenged, and Han was given some peace. The best news was that his granddaughter was still alive, and the Jedi helped her understand that the Dark Lord had manipulated her mind against Boba. She too was prevented from going down to the surface of Mandalore. But Boba had one more trick up his sleeve, always with an eye towards useful allies. He had befriended Natashi Dalla during the war. She broke away from Caedus' empire and used her fleets to fight the Remnant. But her war crimes stretched back decades, helping to work on exotic prototype weapons early on in her career, and later fighting against the New Republic. The NR could not forgive her sins, and had her thrown in prison. Fett knew this Imperial could work with his scientists to fight off this virus. The Mandalore launched a daring jailbreak, and offered her freedom in exchange for a cure. Dalla's insights proved crucial, and the virus was completely eliminated from the planet. The millions of Mandawade cheering the return of their Mandalore. And it would be on this throne that Boba Fett would live out the rest of his days. Boba Fett achieved all of the goals set out for him by his father. He truly carried on Jaster's legacy. making Mandalore stronger than ever before, and even getting the chance to spread that ethic across the entire galaxy. He also had to master his own mind, finding ways to forgive old enemies like Solo and the Jedi, in order to live by his warrior code, defying death multiple times, and firmly securing his place in galactic history, and recorded as one of, if not the most important Mandalores in all of Mandalorian history. Thank you guys for watching this epic multi-part series on the complete legend of Boba Fett. But most important of all, remember, always trust in your code of honor, and the Force will be with you, always.